Fellow sapiens, dim the lights, take a slow breath, and let your shoulders loosen. Tonight, we will walk across a plateau of stone and memory. This is a calm, evidence-first telling, slow, precise, and kind to the people who lived here long before modern maps gave them new names. If you like careful history told for quiet hours, consider subscribing and leaving a like. Tell me in the comments when you listen, at night, while cooking, or as you fall asleep. Timestamps are in the description if you want to skip ahead. Now, let's begin. Cold open micro scene, dawn discovery, immersive. You stand on a high ridge as dawn lifts over a wide, folding country. The air is cool and thin with early light. Below you, the broken silhouette of a great wall slices the slope, a sequence of rounded curves and rectilinear courts, bands of stone that, from a distance, could be a herd of sleeping elephants. Up close, the stones are not mortared. They fit together like patient teeth. Each block was shaped by human hands, each joint a decision made in time. A small flock of pigeons lifts from a low roof platform and spins away, scattering the smoky breath of the valley. You step down toward an entrance where the wall thins and a passage narrows into a throat. The dust on the path is fine, ash-gray sandstone, caught in the grooves of sandals long gone. An old pot rim juts from the earth near your foot, half buried and flecked with fire. It smells faintly of char. In your hand is a small object, a soapstone bird, its curve worn by centuries of fingers and sun. The bird is no taller than your palm. Its beak is blunt, its surface polished to a soft sheen where it was held. Someone some time ago placed it on a ledge like a votive, and later someone else lifted it, and 1,000 others, into a single pile of human attention. Now it rests in your palm, cool and intimate. As you turn the bird, the Great Wall opens up behind you, a sequence of enclosures, circular and rectilinear, like pages in a book. Hearths, post holes, paved floors appear in the shallow light. A distant sound moves across the plain, the hollow note of a gourd drum, or the wind through tall grasses. It could be either. You imagine voices, market cries, bargaining in a tongue that carried both the rhythms of home and the foreign cadences of traders from the coast. The place feels both settled and expectant. It is a city made of stone, but also of heat, of smoke, of the small apparatus of daily life. A spindle furl, a bead, the rim of a bowl. You lift your gaze to the horizon, where a thin line suggests a route, a river in the distance, or the path toward the lowlands and the coast. You think of ships far off, of sailors and merchants who would trade in beads and cloth, in glass and porcelain, in news and rewards. This small bird in your hand connects those hands across hundreds of miles and many lives. It is a hinge between the intimate and the vast. The central question rises like warm air. Who made these walls? Who arranged these birds? And what was Great Zimbabwe to the people who lived and worked here between the 11th and 15th centuries? Was it a palace, a town, a ritual center, a hub of a trade network, or all of these in overlapping rhythms? And when later travelers and empires saw the stones, what stories did they tell about those people? Stories that simplified, dismissed, or claimed. In this series, we will hold that small soapstone bird close to the light while we read the wider landscape around it. We will listen to what the stones reveal, test the dates with modern methods, weigh the objects found here against the voice of oral memory, and separate what is known from what remains debated. Where evidence is thin, we will mark it clearly. Where the record is rich, we will follow it patiently. For now, feel the weight of the bird in your hand. Feel the dawn. Let the quiet make room for careful observation. In the next part, we will step off the ridge and walk the country that made these walls possible, the geology, the water, and the roots that tied plateau to coast. You step off the high ridge and let the ground take your weight. The plateau is not a single flat slab, but a stitched landscape. Broad, rolling uplands broken by outcrops of ancient rock, shallow valleys that hold seasonal water, and low koppies, rounded granite hills that punctuate the horizon. The stone here is old, hard, and patient. It has been wrung from deep time. It resists wind and rain by sheer density. The builders of Great Zimbabwe found their raw material already waiting in the land. Geology first. The plateau sits on a substrate of crystalline rock, granite and related gneisses, baked and cooled in a form that often leaves domes and tors exposed at the surface. Those domes are the places you see the familiar dry stone walls. The builders worked with blocks of granite that split in natural sheets and could be shaped into courses. Granite is not a soft, easily carved stone. It demands time, effort, and repeat blows with hammerstones. That labor shaped an aesthetic and a technique, walls that curve, that step, that absorb and reflect light through the day. The architecture grew from the qualities of the stone itself. Water shapes settlement. Rainfall in this part of southern Africa is seasonal. The rains come, the grasses swell, crops are planted and harvested. Then the dry months follow. Permanent rivers are not everywhere. Near Great Zimbabwe, smaller rivers and seasonal streams collect runoff and feed deeper channels downstream. People who lived here learned to read the pulse of the plateau, where a spring lingered after the rains, where hollows trapped water and supported certain plants, where a shallow well or a cistern could be dug and lined. The placement of enclosures and dwellings follows those water logics: higher ground for defense and display, lower terraces for gardens, storage, and animals. Soils on the plateau vary. On the thin, stony slopes, the soil is shallow but workable, good for drought-tolerant grains, sorghum and pearl millet, and for the grasses that support cattle. In the sheltered hollows, deeper soils held seed beds for sorghum, legumes, and local herbs. Cattle were a visible material of value here. Not just meat, but status, bride wealth, and traction on the land. Herds shaped movement, dictated where kraals might be placed, and influenced the exchange of wealth. The landscape, therefore, is both stage and actor. It provides stone and soil, pasture and path. Wood matters. The upland woodlands, miambo, and other dry forest types offer timber, firewood, and charcoal. Charcoal, in turn, fuels high-temperature crafts, pottery kilns, and iron-smelting furnaces. Without a steady supply of wood, production slows. That dependence on trees creates a relationship between settlement density and resource management. Paths to reliable timber patches become important. So, do systems of seasonal collection and perhaps rules about cutting. The archaeological signs, charcoal signatures in hearths, remnants of ash, traces of burned timbers, tell us that the people here had to plan for fuel as carefully as for food. Mineral wealth is a quiet, persuasive force. The plateau sits within a broader region where gold-bearing veins and alluvial deposits occur. It is likely no accident that long-distance merchants found their way into this inland world. Gold does not reveal itself in tidy veins on the surface. It hides in quartz bands or in river gravels. People who knew the land, craftsmen and diggers, could locate and extract the bright metal that, once refined, carried enormous value on the coast and across the ocean. Iron ores, too, fed local metallurgy. Hoes, nails, knives, sibami-sis, and symbolic objects were forged where metalworking was practiced. Clay for pottery and softer stones for carving, like steatite used for small birds, were also part of the resource mix. Each raw material tells a story of a local economy that was capable, attentive, and networked. Movement across the plateau follows gentle logics. Paths are not the straight lines of maps, but the worn grooves of repeated feet, of cattle herds, of ox-drawn carts when wheeled traffic arrived, and of porters carrying loads toward the lowlands. Some routes will run toward major river valleys that, in turn, lead to the coastal trading towns. Others fan out to neighboring plateaus and valleys where allied or rival communities lived. The plateau is both a hub and a crossroads, close enough to the coast to matter to Indian Ocean traders, far enough inland to require sustained, local organization. Settlement patterns reflect these geographies. The Great Walls cluster on the ridge tops and around defensible koppies. Courtyards and enclosures open to protected precincts where leaders, specialists, and households could organize their work. Outside those walls are evidence of daily life: pottery sherds with cooking soot, post holes where thatch-roofed huts once stood, middens of animal bone that tell of diet. The city is not a single monolith of stone, but a constellation. Inner platforms for certain activities, peripheral compounds for others, and a surrounding countryside that fed it. Seasonality governs rhythm. Planting and harvest seasons structure labor and festival. Dry months may channel people toward craft production, mending tools, refining metal, finishing beadwork, while rainy months demand attention to fields. Trade itself moves with seasons. Rivers swell and transport becomes easier or harder. Monsoon winds shape when coastal ships sail, pushing goods inland in certain months and returning with cargoes in others. The people of the plateau worked within these moving constraints, aligning local cycles with continental currents. This landscape also shapes memory and meaning. Stones on a ridge are visible for miles. They become landmarks, anchors for stories. A wall rising from a copy reads as permanence in a world of seasonal change. To stand among those walls is to feel the deliberate act of building against time, an assertion that some human projects can last longer than a single life. Practicalities of building follow from this geography. Quarrying granite requires choices. Extract where the stone is accessible, move blocks along defined paths, shape them with hammerstones and pounding tools into courses that fit snugly without mortar. The result is a style that is both economical and expressive. Round towers, sweeping enclosures, and careful coursing that resists slumping. Those choices reflect local know-how, transmitted skill, and a shared aesthetic that values balance and durability. As you walk down the slope and the air warms, notice how sound changes. Voices carry across the hollow. A pot clacks in a distant courtyard. Perhaps somewhere a bellows sighs as metal glows in embers. The land is not empty. It hums with activity that ties soil to stone, water to hearth, and distant markets to nearby fields. In the next part, we will put our hands on the walls themselves, examining the dry stone technique, the geometry of enclosure, and what the masonry tells us about labor, organization, and meaning. We will listen to the stones as evidence and begin to separate craft from ceremony. Move closer. Put your palm against the cool face of the wall and feel the slow warmth of stone shaped by long weather. The individual blocks are coarse, granite broken into usable sheets, but the course's read is deliberate. The surface is not rough rubble tossed together, it is ordered. Each stone meets its neighbor in a careful seam, and seams line up into courses that run the length of curves and corners. There is a quiet discipline here, a mason's sense that balance and fit will make the structure endure. The builders of Great Zimbabwe worked without mortar. That absence is not a lack, but a choice with many consequences. Without mortar, each stone must be cut or struck so that its face mates well with the one beside it. That fitting requires labor and skill, hammerstones to peck and dress the granite, wedges to split sheets, and judgment to place each block where its shape and weight best support the course above. The result is a dry stone structure whose stability depends on geometry as much as mass. A slight inward tilt, what builders call a batter, helps the wall resist outward pressure. Curved walls distribute load in 3 dimensions. Rounded corners mean no single seam becomes a weak point. The walls breathe, they settle slowly over generations, rather than cracking suddenly. Under the neat facade of dressed stones, builders often used a practical technique. 2 facing skins of carefully set blocks with an interior fill of smaller rubble and packed earth. This creates a thick, stable wall that economizes the use of finely dressed blocks, saved for the external, visible courses, while relying on mass and compaction to give the whole body strength. Where the wall steps down a slope, the courses adjust like a staircase, each course conforming to the contours of the ground. Where the wall circles a platform, the stones curve in a gentle, almost musical arc. Construction leaves traces. Tool marks persist if you know where to look. Peck marks along a fracture plane, faint striations where a stone was rasped to fit, the occasional insertion of a small wedge stone to take up a gap. These are the fingerprints of practice, of eyes that learned how much to chip away and when to stop. They are also an archive of skill transmission. The same kinds of marks repeat in different parts of the complex, suggesting shared workshops or master masons teaching apprentices. The architecture is not merely functional. The arrangement of enclosures, platforms, and passages shapes movement and sightlines. Enter through a broad opening and a court unfolds. Approach a tower, and the rise reveals a view across the valley. The Great Enclosure, the largest of the site's courts, creates a sense of interiority and display. You step into a space that holds attention inward. You are enclosed and yet above the surrounding landscape. The conical tower, a smooth tapering object of stone, rises like a fulcrum in the Great Enclosure. Its exact function remains debated among scholars. Some suggest a symbolic or cosmological meaning. Others propose a practical role, such as a grain store or a marker of elite control. The tower's finish and relative prominence demonstrate intentionality. Someone designed it to be seen and to be read by those who came near. Labor and organization show through the architecture as plainly as through the stones. Moving blocks of granite is heavy work. Quarrying, shaping, hauling, and placing stones requires organized teams: carriers, masons, preparers for tools, and those who fed and housed the workforce. It is likely that building projects employed both full-time specialists and seasonal laborers who joined for major campaigns, especially after harvest when labor could be spared. That pattern fits many pre-modern societies where construction cycles align with agricultural calendars. The presence of sophisticated masonry argues for social mechanisms that could coordinate labor and manage resources, leadership, sanctions, and incentives that persuaded people to contribute time and effort. Skill differentiation matters. Not everyone touched the dressed stones. Some made tools, some produced pottery and beads, others managed storage and food. Specialists, master masons, held knowledge of geometry and load, of how a curve could take weight, of how to integrate passages and drains. Their craft shows a continuity of practice. Styles of coursing and choice of stone repeat across the site and its satellite settlements. That stylistic echo is a social fingerprint, pointing to networks of apprenticeship and shared standards. The walls also encode social boundaries. The Great Enclosure and the hill complex appear to demarcate internal and external spaces, areas of higher privacy or prestige set apart from bulk living zones. Enclosures might mark ritual precincts, elite residences, or administrative quarters. They might host gatherings where goods were redistributed, where leaders pronounced decisions, or where craft guilds organized their work. The flow between courts, the presence of raised platforms and hearths, and the interleaving of storage pits with living space all speak to a social architecture that blends the public and the domestic. Maintenance is part of the story too. A dry stone wall is enduring, but not immortal. Weather, root growth, and human reuse demand repair. That ongoing attention suggests that the place remains significant across generations. Repair layers, newer stones set into older courses, patches that adopt a slightly different technique, are palimpsests of care. People kept the walls in use. They did not abandon them lightly. A wall is also an argument. Its visibility says, someone here can marshal resources long enough to make something that outlasts seasons. That statement plays into political influence. Larger, more labor-intensive enclosures project capacity and authority. But we must not leap from architecture to fixed hierarchies without caution. Monumental walls can both reflect centralized power and result from cooperative strategies where many households contribute to common projects for mutual benefit. The people here could have organized collectively, under charismatic leaders, or a mix of both. Interpretation often stumbles at presumptions. Early accounts imposed external categories, calling the complex a palace, or conversely, dismissing it as a fort, without reading the local signals. Modern archaeology reads the place differently. The walls are at once practical and symbolic. They protect and display. They manage space and channel perception. The truth is layered and subtle, revealed by stone and soil together. Before we leave the masonry for a moment, notice how time has softened edges. Stones that were once sharp now round under wind and human touch. Lichens live in the minimal mortarless seams. The wall is an active surface, growing small ecosystems and inviting small hands to trace its joints. That slow accretion, the patina of time, becomes part of the site's meaning. It signals age, continuity, and the fact that people kept returning here long after the original builders laid the first course. In the next part, we will put the small soapstone bird back under the lens. We will examine the sculpted objects, birds and other carved forms, their contexts, and how they might signal identity, ritual practice, or status. We will balance symbolic readings with the material facts, where these objects appear, how they were made, and how they travel. Gentle now, and we will follow those traces together. Hold the bird again in your hand, and let the shape do the talking. It is compact and smooth, carved from a soft, greasy stone that takes detail easily and polishes to a gentle sheen. The form is abstracted, no feathers sketched stroke by stroke, but the silhouette is insistently avian: a body, a small head, a blunt beak. Some examples sit upright, like little sentinels. Others are more elongated, like a bird in profile. The variety is subtle, but deliberate. These are not accidental pebbles. They are crafted things with choices baked into every curve. Material first. The birds are usually carved from steatite, often called soapstone, a metamorphic rock rich in talc that is relatively soft compared with granite. Because it is workable, steatite has long been a favored medium for small, portable carvings. The stone can be sourced from particular outcrops in the region, and the choice of soapstone itself tells us about networks of raw material procurement and the expertise to work it. Carving a bird requires a few essential tools: a point to rough out the shape, abrading stones to refine the curves, and a final polishing with sand and water or organic oils to achieve the soft surface. The traces of those tools, peck marks, smoothing planes, tiny abrasions, can persist under microscopy and offer direct evidence of manufacture technique. Context matters at least as much as the object. Birds are commonly found within the hill complex and the Great Enclosure, sometimes in clusters, sometimes alone on ledges, sometimes in deposits associated with hearths or floors. Archaeologists report concentrations, piles or caches suggestive of deliberate placement. Where they appear in domestic contexts, we read one set of possibilities: talismans, household emblems, or items of status kept in reach. Where they appear in public or high-status courtyards, another logic suggests itself: markers of corporate identity, symbols of office, or offerings placed in visible settings for communal recognition. The variability of find spots resists a single sweeping interpretation. Function is the puzzle. Many interpret the birds as emblematic, tokens of lineage, clan insignia, or markers of authority that could be displayed and recognized across a crowded courtyard. Others see them as votive objects, small, portable offerings set at thresholds or on platforms in acts of remembrance or petition. Some scholars have emphasized their appearance near elite spaces as evidence that they functioned in status performance, visual shorthand for who belonged where. Yet we must resist rushing from presence near an elite enclosure to simplistic claims of royal insignia. Material culture often crosses social boundaries, and objects can be both widely used and potent symbols at the same time. Symbolic readings draw on ethnographic and comparative work, but cautiously. Birds have broad symbolic resonances in many cultures: connection with sky, communication across worlds, ancestral messengers. In this region, later oral traditions and artistic analogies sometimes link birds to leadership, to rainmaking, or to cosmological roles. Those echoes are suggestive, not definitive. The archaeological value lies precisely in such layers. When form, context, and later social memory cohere, our interpretations gain weight. When they diverge, we mark uncertainty. Manufacture and distribution tell a social story. The stylistic consistency across many birds implies a shared repertoire of shapes and aesthetic norms. That could indicate specialized carvers working in workshops or circulating design standards taught through apprenticeship. The presence of birds of the same style at multiple satellite sites suggests exchange, either in the form of objects moving across networks or of itinerant craftsmen carrying the patterns. Sometimes birds appear alongside imported goods, beads, glass, or ceramics, placing them within a larger economy of material signaling. Local emblem plus distant prestige goods equals a social language that speaks both inward to local audiences and outward to traders and visitors. Wear patterns are informative. Under magnification, a bird that shows smoothing on its base or specific polish lines can indicate habitual handling. Perhaps it was passed frequently, touched in ritual, or carried on a person. Residue analysis might pick up traces of organic matter, oils, plant resins, or pigments, suggesting that the birds could have been painted or treated. Microstratigraphy, where we can see how the bird sits within a floor deposit, helps date the use life. Was it placed at the moment of construction, left in a later layer, or curated across many episodes? These scientific glimpses let objects speak across centuries. We must be careful about chronology. The birds appear across a long range of occupation layers. Some may be earlier, some later. Without careful stratigraphic control and, where possible, direct dating of associated organic residues or sealed contexts, it's easy to conflate objects from different generations. That mixing is especially tempting at sites with long reuse histories, places that were inhabited, repaired, and re-inhabited for centuries. Thus, every interpretive claim should note whether it rests on secure context or on more circumstantial association. Myth and modern projection are persistent risks. From the 19th century onward, Outsiders sometimes impose their own metaphors onto these birds, seeing them as exotic signs or as proof of foreign authorship. Decades of careful archaeology have pushed back against those convenient narratives, showing instead that the birds fit into a coherent local sequence of material practice. Still, we must remain alert to how modern desires, for neat stories, for sensational connections to distant empires, can cloud sober readings of the archaeological record. There is also a living aspect. For communities today, such objects carry meaning that intersects with contemporary identities and heritage. Local people may see soapstone birds as ancestral objects or as markers linking present-day communities with past builders. That living connection matters. Archaeology that treats artifacts as museum curiosities misses the ethical dimension of objects that are part of ongoing local memory. When researchers study, conserve, or display such pieces, they are engaging not only with antiquity, but with the present responsibilities of stewardship and respect. Ethical note, brief. Treat carved objects as both scientific data and living heritage. Decisions to sample, to remove, or to conserve should involve local stakeholders. Destructive testing, if ever proposed, needs clear justification, the smallest possible sample, and collaborative consent. Where possible, non-destructive imaging and analysis should come first. Soft reflection and invitation. Let the bird rest in your palm again. It is small, portable, and surprisingly eloquent. Its simplicity invites many readings: status token, votive offering, workshop product, or identity marker. And the truth may be that it was sometimes all of these at once. Objects like this teach us patience. The same little shape moves across courtyards and centuries, gathering new meanings as it goes. In the next part, we will widen our view from small objects to daily routines: hearths, pottery, food remains, and the rhythms of household life that made Great Zimbabwe a lived city rather than only a set of walls. We will follow the smells of cooking and the clatter of crafts as evidence of ordinary lives. Dim the lights again, if you like. Breathe slowly. We move now from stones and carved birds into the small, ordinary things that made Great Zimbabwe a lived place. Hearth smoke, clay pots, spindle whorls, the weight of a child on a shoulder, and the soft, constant murmur of neighbors meeting at a shared well. Imagine a morning that smells of smoke and porridge, of warmed clay and damp earth. The great walls circle around these small acts, but they do not replace them. Life here was composed of 1,000 quiet routines. You wake in a round hut, the roof of grass stitched to posts, the floor compacted and darkened, where feet have walked for years. A low fire still holds embers. Nearby, a woman, or perhaps a man, perhaps both, for gendered tasks are rarely simple, stirs a pot of porridge over coals. The grain is sorghum or millet, hardy, stored in pits beneath the floor, or in small raised granaries. A child keeps close, hands sticky with porridge, eyes bright with the small dramas of a new day. The stirring spoon is a tool and a rhythm. Each scrape against the clay pot sings an old familiarity. That sound marks time in households where food preparation structures the day. Pots are everywhere, broken and whole. Pottery styles vary across the site. Bowls for cooking, wide-mouthed jars for storage, shallow dishes for serving. The surfaces may be burnished, slipped, or incised with simple patterns. Each sherd in a midden is a fragment of habit. The angle of a rim can tell you what the pot held, soot on the base tells you how it was used. Pottery is both utilitarian and expressive. Makers shape vessels to fit cooking fires, but they also sign them with patterned strokes that connect households and local aesthetic choices. Textiles are less often preserved, but their traces persist in tools. Spindle whorls, small rounded weights, appear in domestic deposits. They are the quiet markers of fiber work, spinning cotton, plant fibers, or wild wool into thread. Threads turn into cloth for clothing, for wrapping children, for trade. Basketry and matting soften floors, carry harvests, and line storage pits. These woven goods are everyday engineering, shaped by local plants and skillful hands. Beads and personal ornamentation are constant. Small glass beads, vivid blues, greens, and translucent hues, are common finds in burials and house debris. They do not grow here. They arrive as part of long-distance exchange. Locally produced beads, clay or stone, sit alongside imported glass, creating a visual language of identity. Necklaces and bracelets mark belonging, family, age grade, marital status. The act of stringing a bead is a slow conversation, a patient craft that links the intimate body to far-off kilns and furnaces. Metalworking hums in the margins. Iron slag and furnace debris mark areas where smelting occurred. Blacksmiths shape tools and adornments, hoes to open fields, knives for butchery, nails for household repair. The sound of hammer on anvil would have been ordinary, a measured ringing that echoes across courtyards. Metalworkers command specific skill sets and resources: ore, charcoal, bellows, and knowledge. Their products are practical and symbolic. Iron tools clear fields and also signal a household's capacity to maintain itself. Food tells a layered story. Zoo archaeological remains, bones sorted in middens, show a diet built on domesticates and the wild world. Cattle were important. They provided meat, milk, hides, and, crucially, social value in systems of bride wealth and status. Goats and sheep supplied milk and meat too, while chickens offered eggs and smaller, quick meals. Hunting added variety, smaller wild mammals, tortoises, and the occasional larger prey. Fish may appear if people had access to rivers or traded for dried catches. The diet was seasonally colored, more preserves and stored foods in dry months, fresh garden produce in the rains. So, daily plates shifted with the calendar. Childhood and apprenticeship shape continuity. Children learn by watching how to shape a pot, how to weave a basket, how to read the curve of a stone when you place it in a wall. Play is practice. Tiny clay balls might be mock pots. Simple bead stringing introduces fine motor skills. Social roles form gradually, not as fixed boxes, but as learned competences. Youths join adult work in harvest seasons. Elders instruct the next generation in songs, lineage histories, and craft techniques. Markets and exchange appear in small gestures. A courtyard might host periodic gatherings where surplus grain, pots, beads, and tools change hands. Exchange is not just economic, it is social glue. A gift of a pot or a loan of grain creates obligation and relationship. Traders visiting from lowland routes bring goods that astonish and integrate. Imported beads, fragments of glass, nails of a foreign make. These items do not simply cross a distance. They are woven into local networks, reshaped into new meanings, recombined with local craft, and circulated through kin networks. Housing arrangements reflect a social geometry. Some compounds cluster tightly, extended family clusters perhaps, around a communal yard where children play and food is prepared. Other enclosures, within the stone circuits, are more segregated, with platforms that suggest elevated status or specialized use. Storage pits, lined and sealed, safeguarded seed across dry seasons. Raised platforms hold important items off the damp earth. That bird, a cache of beads, or a pot of precious oil. Space management is a household technology. Where you place grain determines how you survive the lean months. Ritual and the ordinary interweave. Hearths are domestic but also domestic altars. Small offerings might be placed at thresholds. Small caches tucked into floors at the birth of a child or the founding of a house. Life and ritual are not strictly separate. The same domestic spaces that hold cooking fires may host rites of passage, naming ceremonies, marriages, or small acts of remembrance, embedding personal life in material practice. Health and care are visible in bones and in the lightly worn tools for preparing food. Dental ware shows a diet of gritty grain, but also the care taken to feed infants. Maternal practices, breastfeeding, the management of weaning foods, shape survival. Community networks provide support when illness hits. Neighbors sharing labor, elders advising on herbal remedies, midwives aiding births. Such care is ordinary and profound. Finally, consider the soundscape. Coppersmiths tapping, children laughing, a woman calling across a yard, the lowing of cattle. Each sound marks a life woven into place. Great Zimbabwe was not only monumental stone, it was the cadence of daily acts repeated and recombined across generations. In the next part, we will follow those sounds beyond the ridge, trace the routes that led from plateau to coast, and examine how inland producers linked with Indian Ocean traders. We will map pathways of exchange and the goods that traveled long distances to become part of household life here. Imagine the plateau as an island of stone in a moving landscape. To the people inside the walls, the world did not stop at the nearest ridge. Instead, pathways stitched this upland into a much larger system, river corridors that ran toward the coast, trade tracks that threaded through lowlands and woodlands, and human highways made by feet, cattle, and porters. Great Zimbabwe was both rooted and outward-facing. Its economy and meaning reached beyond the stones into markets that lay days, weeks, and sometimes months away. Roots begin where the land makes them easy. River valleys offer gentler grades and seasonal water. Ridgelines provide sight and security. On foot or with pack animals, traders and porters favored corridors that balanced speed with safety. From the Zimbabwe Plateau, routes fan outward toward major drainage systems, the Limpopo to the southeast, other tributaries that link into river systems flowing toward the Indian Ocean. Those valleys are the natural channels of exchange. They carry goods, people, and news. But a route is not only geography, it is a social contract. Who knows which path? Who controls a ford? Which groups demand tolls? Which households host passing caravans? Intermediaries knit the system together. Rarely did a single trader stroll the entire distance from the coast to inland capitals alone. Instead, trade worked in stages. Coastal merchants, often residents of Swahili towns along the Indian Ocean, handled maritime exchange and the first leg of distribution. Inland, specialized middlemen and caravans carried goods farther. Beads, cloth, glass, metals, and ceramics moved in stages, changing hands at market nodes and seasonal fairs. Each transfer point added value, knowledge, and social ties. That chain created opportunities for local leaders and entrepreneurs to insert themselves as facilitators, buyers, or redistributors. Goods tell the story of these journeys. Small, intensely colored glass beads are one of the clearest markers of long-distance exchange. They occur in household contexts, in burials, and in caches, evidence that they reached ordinary lives, not only elite display. Such beads often arrived in large numbers, perhaps strung, perhaps in bulk, and they were used as personal ornament, as components in exchange, and as social markers. Their chemical signatures, when analyzed in laboratories, reveal manufacturing traditions tied to coastal or international centers, underscoring their foreign origin. Alongside glass, exotic objects such as fragments of imported ceramics or metalwork occasionally appear at inland sites, indicating contact with maritime trade networks that reached into the wider Indian Ocean world. The coast matters. On the Indian Ocean littoral, towns and entrepôts, places like Kilwa, Sofala, or other Swahili settlements, served as hubs. They handled cargoes from Arabian, Persian, Indian, and even Chinese traders who crossed oceans on seasonal winds. Those sailors brought woven cloth, glass, beads, and ceramics. At coastal markets, inland merchants exchanged local products, gold, ivory, and perhaps agricultural surpluses, for these imported goods. The barleycorn of networks is not a single commodity. Rather, it is a shifting basket of locally valuable items that coastal and inland partners both wanted. Gold is a central thread in many accounts. The interior's gold, found in veins or washed from gravels, had a durable value on distant markets. It could be made into ingots, ornaments, or thin sheet for decoration. Local controls over gold sources mattered. Who managed mines, who processed the metal, who traded it outward. Gold's mobility across vast distances gave inland communities access to oceanic wealth, and that wealth in turn funded displays of social power, stone enclosures, feasts, and the distribution of rare goods. Transport technologies shaped scale. Human porters carried goods in baskets and on headloads. Pack animals, where present, extended reach and payload. In later periods, wagons and ox carts could carry heavier loads along flatter corridors. But even then, terrain and seasonal rains dictated what routes were viable. Seasonal constraints were crucial. Monsoon winds set the rhythm of coastal shipping. River levels and muddy tracks set the tempo of inland movement. Traders timed their journeys to those pulses, creating annual or semi-annual circuits that synced farms, markets, and ports. Exchange is social as well as economic. Gifts, marriage exchanges, and political alliances often use trade items as symbolic currency. A marriage might involve the transfer of beads or cloth that signal family ties. A leader might receive a consignment of imported goods as a tribute, then redistribute them in a public ceremony to cement loyalty. That redistribution is a political technology. Controlling access to prestige items creates social leverage. In that sense, trade goods are not merely consumed. They are instruments in social negotiation. Market nodes and fairs matter. Seasonal gatherings, marked by food, music, and exchange, brought together people from different ecological zones. These gatherings are where inland producers could find coastal luxuries and where coastal traders could obtain gold, ivory, or agricultural staples. Archaeological traces, densities of imported sherds or beads, specialized craft debris, and refuse patterns suggest that certain sites functioned as persistent market nodes. These bazaars were also information hubs. News of distant events, changes in supply, or shifts in political alliances traveled along these networks as keenly as goods did. Evidence in the soil supports these movements. In many places, archaeologists find concentrations of imported materials in contexts that imply repeated exchange over time. Glass beads cluster in household middens. Fragments of foreign ceramics appear in chronological layers that nestle within local pottery sequences. Chemical and microscopic analyses of residues can reveal non-local substances, spices, dyes, or oils that once traveled along the same routes. Such traces allow us to map not only objects, but patterns of consumption and the rhythms of contact. Yet these connections were uneven and negotiated. Not every household had direct access to coastal goods. Access depended on social position, wealth, and network ties. Some families specialized in exporting goods, say gold or cattle, becoming regional brokers, while others remained primarily agrarian and only occasionally engaged in long-distance exchange. Thus, trade contributed to differentiation as well as integration. It tied the plateau to the ocean, but also created new local hierarchies based on who controlled flows of valuable items. Risk and reward walked together. Long caravans faced banditry, bad seasons, and the caprices of politics. Coastal towns themselves could be disrupted by shifting alliances or external pressure. Yet the returns for successful exchange were significant. Access to exotic goods, increased prestige, and resources to sponsor larger projects at home. That dynamic helps explain why inland centers like Great Zimbabwe invested in structures and institutions that could marshal labor and manage surplus, tools for both local life and extended exchange. Finally, remember the human dimension. Each bead that traveled to a household was a small story, sold at a coastal stall, carried across a river, exchanged for grain or gold, and finally threaded into a necklace worn by a child at a wedding. Trade routes were not only economic arteries, they were conversational ones, places where tastes, fashions, and stories moved as readily as goods. In the next part, we will take those traded objects apart and look closely at the beads, porcelains, and other imported materials found at Great Zimbabwe, how archaeologists identify them, what they reveal, and what they do not. We will read the foreign within the local and weigh what these objects tell us about connection and meaning. Pick up a handful of soil from a courtyard midden and let it sift through your fingers. In that small, dark dust are the shards of a long conversation. Bright glass beads, slivers of foreign pottery, a scrap of metal, a flake of shell. These tiny things travel farther than most people. They cross oceans and valleys, becoming part of the ordinary clutter of households. To read them is to listen for distant voices inside a local room. Start with the beads. They come in colors that must have stopped people in their tracks. Cobalt blues, translucent aquamarines, deep olives. Many are small and perfectly spherical, the product of skilled manufacture. When archaeologists describe them, they distinguish by how they were made. Some are wound or molded, others are drawn, stretched into long tubes and cut into identical segments. The manufacturing traces matter. Drawn beads, for instance, often indicate production technologies associated with particular workshops or regions in the Indian Ocean world. How do we know where a bead was made? Here is our first methods box. Scientists use compositional chemistry to fingerprint glass. Techniques like scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, SEMEDS, or laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, LAICPMS, reveal the elemental recipe. Silica from sand, soda, or potash fluxes, colorants like cobalt or copper, trace elements that carry geological signatures. Certain chemical recipes track to broad production zones, some linked to South Asian glassworking traditions, others to Middle Eastern furnaces, and still others to coastal workshops in East Africa and beyond. A bead's chemistry does not give a single GPS point, but it narrows the field. Combine chemistry with typology and context, and the story becomes richer. Porcelain and ceramics arrive with different clues. A sherd's clay, temper, and glaze speak to where and how it was made. Petrographic thin section analysis, cutting a microscopic wafer of pottery and looking at it under polarized light, lets specialists read the mineral inclusions and clay fabric. X-ray fluorescence, XRF, and instrumental neutron activation analysis, INAA, can further quantify elemental composition. For high-fired East Asian porcelains, certain mineralogical and compositional signatures point to kiln complexes in China's Jiangxi or Fujian provinces during particular centuries. Yet beware the temptation to over-precision. A coastal mediator could have brought an object from a far port, or a coastal potter could imitate foreign styles. Thus, provenance claims must rest on multiple lines of evidence. Residue analysis adds another layer. Tiny molecules, lipicides, plant starches, or residues of spices can survive in pottery pores. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS, and proteomics occasionally detect these traces and tell us what the vessel once held. A Chinese sherd might carry traces of soy or fermented products. A local cooking pot might show millet or sorghum signatures. These chemical whispers show how imported items entered daily practice. They were not merely museum goods. They could be used, reused, and incorporated into local routines. Contextual patterning is crucial. Finding a bead in an elite courtyard means something different from finding one scattered in a midden shared by many households. Spatial analysis, mapping where imports concentrate across a site, identifies nodes of consumption and the social reach of exotic items. Often imported goods cluster in contexts interpreted as higher status, near paved platforms, within the hill complex, or in sealed caches. But they also occur in ordinary house debris, indicating that trade goods dispersed across social strata over time. Chronology matters too. Dating contexts precisely helps us link imports to historical pulses, periods of intensified coastal exchange, political consolidation, or climatic shifts that altered routes. Radiocarbon dating of associated organics, optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, for sediments, and careful stratigraphy work together to place beads and sherds in time. Beware of residuality. Objects move. A bead can be curated for decades, deposited later, or reworked into new objects. Interpreters must always ask, is this primary deposition or a secondary mix? There are limits to what the material record can say. Chemical signatures may suggest likely production regions, but rarely reveal individual hands or the precise coastal intermediaries. Trade is mediated by people, brokers, porters, chiefs, whose names rarely survive in the soil. Thus, the archaeological picture is probabilistic, likelihoods, not certainties. We can say robust things. This site had sustained access to Indian Ocean exchange networks. Certain bead types are consistent with South Asian production traditions, but we must stop short of claiming direct voyages between a named coastal town and a named inland courtyard, unless documentary or strong contextual evidence exists. A second uncertainty box centers on scale and social meaning. How many imported items were elite-controlled versus more widely distributed? Did beads function primarily as personal ornament, currency, or ritual paraphernalia? Ethnographic analogies help, but can mislead if applied without care. The safest path is to triangulate, combine chemistry, spatial patterning, burial contexts, oral histories, and documentary mentions from later coastal chronicles when available. Ethical notes belong here. Many non-local artifacts entered international collections during colonial eras under dubious circumstances. When archaeologists study beads and ceramics, they must attend to provenance, consent, and the desires of descendant communities. Non-destructive methods should be favored where possible. When sampling is necessary, minimal and justified extraction with stakeholder involvement and benefit sharing is essential. Display and interpretation must include local voices and avoid presenting artifacts as orphaned trophies. Finally, the human rhythm returns. Imagine a woman threading beads at twilight, choosing a deep blue to mark her daughter's coming of age. Imagine a potter repairing a Chinese sherd into a vessel used for porridge. Imported objects did not remain foreign in daily life. They were adapted, repurposed, and woven into local meanings. A porcelain fragment might be used as a small bowl for medicine. A bead might become part of a child's amulet. The material world is porous. Outer edges flow inward. and the inward reshapes the outer. In the next part, we step behind craftwork to the places of production: kilns, furnaces, smithies. We will examine how local industries, pottery, ironworking, bead making, supported both household needs and wider exchange, and what their remains tell us about labor, technology, and skill. Bring your attention to the hidden heat of the place. If stones speak, then furnaces sing. Behind the public courts and living yards, in low terraces and tucked-in hollows, are the small industrial spots where people turned raw things into useful forms: clay into pots, ore into tools, sand and ash into beads. These are not anonymous factory lines. They are hearths shaped by local skills, seasonal rhythms, and a long apprenticeship of hands that learned how hot is hot enough and when to stop. Pottery production is the most visible craft in everyday middens. Look for wheel marks where they exist, for coil joins, for the fingerprints of hands that shaped rims and burnished surfaces. Kiln structures in this region are often simple but effective. Open firing pits, updraft, or ground-level firing areas, sometimes enhanced by wind-guiding features. Fuel economics matters here. Where wood is precious, potters learn to stack efficiently, to fire multiple vessels in a single, carefully arranged load, and to use temper, the addition of sand, crushed rock, or organic material to prevent cracking. Clay selection is local knowledge. Different clays shrink and respond differently under heat. Experienced potters mix and test for the right body for cooking pots versus storage jars. Vessel form follows function, and kiln strategies follow both clay and the pot's intended life. Ironworking is louder and more dramatic. A smith's compound is signaled by slag heaps, glassy, scoriaceous waste left behind after smelting, by furnace bases, and by concentrations of ore and tuyere fragments, the ceramic or clay pipe that channels air into a furnace. Smelting, the process of reducing ore to a malleable bloom, requires high and sustained temperatures. In this region, archaeologists have found furnaces that used a combination of charcoal, forced air via bellows, and compact furnace architecture to reach the necessary heat. The bloom produced after smelting would then be worked on an anvil, refined into axes, hoes, or nails. Slag is a crucial archive. Its composition, silicate glassy residues, metallic prills, and entrapped oxides reveals the efficiency of smelting, the ore type used, and sometimes the technological choices employed, e.g., charcoal cleanliness, furnace temperature. Metallographic and chemical analyses of slag and metal artifacts let us reconstruct operational sequences. Were smiths refining blooms repeatedly? Were they recycling scrap metal? Did they alloy intentionally with copper or other metals, or aim for nearly pure iron? Each answer gives a glimpse into how craftsmen thought about materials and purpose. Bead production is quieter but technologically intricate. Local production of beads, made from clay, stone, or shell, coexists with imported glass beads. Experimental archaeology and residue studies show that some types of glass bead finishing could be done locally. Heating, reaming out cores, and polishing could be accomplished with simple tools and kilns. Shell beads require drilling, grinding, and polishing. Stone beads require pecking and abrading. The presence of bead preparation debris, small perforators, grinding stones, glass preforms, indicates on-site finishing and perhaps specialized beadworkers who focused on this trade. Spatial patterning of production matters. Workshops cluster where resource access and privacy align, near water for clay, close to woodlands for charcoal, and not too close to the main domestic yard because of smoke and the hazards of sparks. At Great Zimbabwe, archaeologists map concentrations: pottery wasters near firing areas, slag mounds near smelting complexes, bead debris in smaller, more private clusters. That spatial separation reflects both practicalities and social arrangements. Some crafts may have been household-based and diffusely distributed. Others, like large-scale smelting, may have required specialized sites and teams. Technology transmits. Tools appear in the archaeological record: hammers, anvils, clay molds, and tuyeres, and their forms change slowly through time. Apprenticeship seems likely, young people learning the craft by working with a master. Ethnoarchaeology, observations of modern craft communities in similar ecological settings, helps us imagine work rhythms, seasonal intensification, shared labor pools, and social obligations to produce for kin or patrons. Experimental smithing and pottery reconstructions also test archaeologists' hypotheses. Can a certain furnace design plausibly reach the temperatures required? Which wood burned best? These reconstructions do not replace original practice, but they show that certain technological pathways are plausible and efficient. Labor organization is a large question with social consequences. Big building projects and sustained craft production require coordination. Who organizes charcoal supply? Who ensures ore gets to the furnace? Who feeds pithits during long smelting campaigns? Some combination of household labor, specialist teams, and broader community obligations must have been at play. The very presence of large slag mounds and extensive pottery wasters implies sustained, sometimes intensive production across seasons or years, more than one household could plausibly supply on its own. Trade in raw materials is another layer. Iron ore and good clay may be local, but certain finishing materials, high-quality temper, exotic pigments, or specific shell types for beads must be acquired from farther afield. That creates mini networks, specialists trading among themselves, interlinking with the larger caravan routes that carry finished goods outward. So, craft production is nested inside an economy of inputs and outputs. Household life and long-distance exchange loop together. Environmental impacts remind us that technology has consequences. Charcoal demand for smelting and firing drives pressure on nearby woodlands. Reuse of land for workshops and the disposal of waste, slag, broken pots, alter local soils. These effects might be small relative to later industrial transformations, but they reflect a long history of human-environment interaction that required planning and perhaps rules for sustainable resource use. Material culture ethics reappear here. Excavation of workshop areas often recovers items that communities today consider heritage objects. Engagement with local stakeholders about sampling for scientific analyses, like metallography or organic residue testing, is essential. Non-destructive imaging, X-ray, portable XRF, can reveal much without damage. Where destructive sampling is necessary, minimal, transparent, and democratically agreed procedures should guide research. Finally, the human scene. A smith bent over a small anvil, sparks catching early light, a potter carrying a fired load to a courtyard for cooling, a beadworker threading tiny drilled shells late into the evening. Production is not merely economic. It is skill, pride, and identity. Craft knowledge anchors people to place. The objects they made carried meanings, practical, symbolic, and social, into the wider world. In the next part, we turn outward again, to the fragile and troubling history of interpretation. The early European stories and colonial myths that tried to explain Great Zimbabwe away. We will read those narratives and then begin the careful undoing that archaeology performed in response. Dim the lights again and breathe. History sometimes arrives not only in carefully dug trenches, but in the prose and claims of travelers who stepped onto a place with their own questions already formed. Great Zimbabwe's stones attracted attention early and loudly. The first European eyes that saw them often could not imagine that local African communities had built such a monumental complex. Instead, they reached for explanations that sounded familiar to them. Ancient mariners, lost civilizations, or distant emissaries. Those early stories shaped public imagination for more than a century. Tonight we'll read those narratives slowly, mark where they misread the evidence, and track how careful archaeology recentered local agency. The pattern is familiar. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a string of explorers, prospectors, and settlers arrived in the highlands and described a ruined stone city that looked older and grander than what some of them expected from the local landscape. Confronted by massive dressed walls and conical towers, many reached for distant parallels. Some proposed Phoenician or ancient Mediterranean builders. Others invoked Arab or South Asian links as the best explanation for such monumental masonry. In the language of that moment, the proposals sounded scholarly or adventurous. In social effect, they were ideological. They denied the technical and organizational capacity of local African polities. And in doing so, they provided moral cover for colonial claims that Africans could not have produced such complex architecture. These early accounts have to be read in context. The European explorers were operating within intellectual currents colored by racism, imperial competition, and an appetite for exotic continuity with the classical past. For many colonial administrators and settlers, admitting that an advanced populous African polity had long existed in the interior endangered a convenient narrative that colonial rule was bringing order and civilization to an otherwise timeless or empty landscape. Alternative narratives, those that recognized resilient, complex African states, threatened that justification. So, stories that pushed authorship outward to Phoenicians, to lost Hebrews, or to medieval coastal merchants did more than misidentify builders. They supported a political logic. We must also note the economic backstory. The same landscape promised mineral wealth, gold in the imaginaries of merchants and colonialists. Linking the ruins to ancient foreign traders who had mined gold fit well with myths of transoceanic commerce that validated European extraction and authority. The stones became a stage on which many modern economic and political desires were projected. How did these myths get corrected? The process is instructive because it shows archaeology at its best: patient, methodical, and willing to change conclusions in the light of evidence. In the 20th century, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s, systematic excavations and careful recording began to tell a different story. Fieldwork that recorded stratigraphy, artifact associations, and the sequence of building phases provided a chain of evidence that pointed to a medieval, African-built complex, one whose chronology fit between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries CE when read with modern dating methods. That conclusion did not rely on wishful thinking. It relied on layers of material culture, local pottery sequences, ironworking debris, soapstone artifacts, and radiometrically datable organics, found in context beneath and within the stoneworks. Key voices in shifting the narrative deserve careful mention. A new generation of archaeologists insisted on excavating with systematic methods, documenting contexts, mapping plans, and testing hypotheses rather than fitting evidence into pre-existing stories. Those investigators worked with local informants and paid attention to oral histories, which, when handled respectfully, added nuance rather than simple confirmation. Over decades, a convergence of evidence, stratigraphy, typology, and later absolute dating, built a compelling case for local African origins and for intensive engagement with coastal exchange networks, rather than external construction by distant colonizers. Still, myths are sticky. For decades, outdated accounts circulated in popular books, museums, and school texts. Interpretive frames rooted in colonial-era thought continued to linger, sometimes reappearing in surprising forms. That persistence reveals how interpretive inertia works. Once a bright, simple story sets in, it resists correction. Undoing it demands not only new data, but also public conversation and the repatriation of narrative authority to communities whose ancestors built and used the site. There are ethical and political layers here we cannot avoid. Archaeological reinterpretation challenged not only academic claims, but also the political uses those claims served. During colonial rule, the misattribution of Great Zimbabwe's builders had real social consequences. It underpinned ideologies that disempowered local people and justified exclusionary policies. Restoring indigenous authorship is therefore more than a correction of facts. It is part of a broader project to restore dignity and rightful heritage ownership. Modern scholarship recognizes this explicitly. Responsibility to descendant communities and transparent, collaborative research became ethical goods as important as methodological rigor. We also need to separate different kinds of correction. Some early claims were simply wrong in light of better data, wrong because they misread pottery, misinterpreted stratigraphy, or ignored the long sequence of local artifacts. Other claims were willfully constructed to serve political ends. Distinguishing innocent error from deliberate misrepresentation helps us keep a clear moral ledger. The scholarly project that corrected the record did so by assembling independent lines of evidence, material, contextual, and increasingly scientific, that converge on a single, more accurate conclusion. Contemporary work continues to refine chronology, understand social organization, and recover the site's living meanings. But the core correction stands. Great Zimbabwe was built by local African polities during the medieval period and was integrated into regional systems of trade, craft, and politics. That consensus is robust because it rests on multiple methods and repeatable results. Soft reflection. Before we move on, myths teach us about the interpreters as much as the interpreted. When a particular theory has more to do with the storyteller's assumptions than with the material record, archaeology must push back. The stones of Great Zimbabwe do not change to please narratives. They reveal patiently if we listen carefully. In the next part, we will examine the methods that made this correction possible, how stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, optically stimulated luminescence, chemical sourcing, and bioarchaeological techniques combine to build chronological and behavioral inferences. We will look at what each method can and cannot do, and why multiple lines of evidence matter. Dim the lights again. Put your curiosity in gentle focus. We are now moving from the feel of stone and the shape of objects to the ways scholars say, with quantified confidence, this happened then. This part is a tools and proof chapter, a calm tour through the methods archaeologists use to build the chronology of Great Zimbabwe and the caveats that come with each technique. We'll keep explanations plain, note what each method can and cannot tell us, and show why multiple lines of evidence matter. Stratigraphy, the first rule of archaeology, is simple and profound. Layers in the ground form like pages in a book. Newer deposits accumulate on top of older ones. Excavators record those layers carefully, noting where an artifact sits within a sequence of floors, hearths, and construction phases. A pottery sherd sealed under a floor gives a terminus ante quem, a no later than date, for that floor. A bead found within a sealed pit can be associated with whatever else the pit contains. Stratigraphy does not give absolute years, but it provides the essential context that lets absolute methods mean something. Without good stratigraphic control, dates float. Radiocarbon, 14C dating, is the workhorse for many medieval chronologies. Organic material, charcoal from hearths, seeds, bone collagen, contains radioactive carbon that decays predictably. Labs measure how much 14C remains and calculate how long ago the organism died. But radiocarbon has important wrinkles. First, samples must be securely associated with the context you want to date. Charcoal in a hearth that postdates a construction tells you when people used the hearth, not necessarily when a wall was built. Second, calibration curves convert radiocarbon years into calendar years. These curves vary and introduce multi-century plateaus or wiggles that broaden uncertainty. Third, old wood effects arise if the dated wood grew for centuries before being burned. Dating that charcoal then gives an age older than the burning event. Careful sample selection, short-lived seeds, annual grasses, or directly dated short-lived materials is therefore better when available. Optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, and thermoluminescence, TL, offer complementary pathways. OSL dates the last time mineral grains in sediments or construction fills were exposed to sunlight. It is useful for dating when a wall's construction used sediment that was buried and reset at a known moment. TL can date the last firing of ceramic materials, when a pot or brick was subjected to high heat in a kiln. Both methods are powerful where radiocarbon cannot help, but they carry their own assumptions. OSL requires that the grains were sufficiently exposed to light just before deposition. Partial bleaching will bias dates older. TL requires that the sample's thermal history is well understood and free from later heating events. Cross-dating with imported goods is a practical anchor. Certain imported ceramics and coin types have well-established manufacture dates on the coast or in faraway kilns. If you find a diagnostic Chinese porcelain fragment that can be stylistically or chemically linked to a known kiln phase, and that fragment sits in a sealed layer within Great Zimbabwe, it provides a useful chronological marker. This is not absolute dating in the physics sense, but it is historically informative, especially when combined with radiocarbon and luminescence results. Material science methods support provenance and movement. Techniques such as LAICP-MS, laser ablation, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, fingerprint trace elements in glass beads, PXRF, portable X-ray fluorescence, surveys ceramic glazes and metal artifacts, petrographic thin sections read mineral inclusions in pottery clay. These analyses do not give calendar dates, but they tell us whether an object is local or non-local, which in turn helps build narratives of contact and timing when paired with dated contexts. Bioarchaeology and biomolecular tools have matured rapidly and provide fine-grained behavioral signals. Stable isotope analyses, strontium, oxygen, on human and animal teeth and bones track mobility and diet. Strontium ratios reflect local geology, so a mismatch between childhood dental signatures and local plateau values suggests migration. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes reveal proportions of C3 barb C4 plants and animal protein in diets. Ancient DNA, aDNA, can trace ancestry and affinity, but tropical preservation is often poor. DNA molecules break down faster in hot, humid climates. This limitation does not render aDNA useless, but it means expectations must be tempered. Proteomics and dental calculus studies sometimes succeed where aDNA yields little. Proteomics, studying ancient proteins, can detect species in residues or micro-remains and is often more resilient in warm contexts. Dental calculus, calcified plaque, traps proteins, starches, and DNA fragments, offering a tiny archive of diet and microbes when preservation allows. Residue analysis on pottery, GCMS lipid analysis, detects fats, plant oils, and other organic molecules absorbed into ceramic matrices. These chemical fingerprints help identify what pots once held millet porridge, dairy fats, or fermented products, and thus inform subsistence and culinary practice. But residue results are probabilistic. They suggest likely contents rather than giving exact recipes. Each method brings uncertainties. This is a methods-focused, uncertainty box. Radiocarbon calibration wiggles produce ranges rather than points. OSL can be biased by incomplete light exposure. Residue analyses may be contaminated by later inputs. aDNA preservation is variable, and all of these rest on correct archaeological context. A misassigned sample can mislead the whole interpretation. The solution is convergence. When radiocarbon, OSL, typology, imported ceramic anchors, and stratigraphic sequencing point to the same window, confidence grows. Good practice therefore follows redundancy and minimal destructiveness. Where possible, researchers prioritize short-lived radiocarbon samples, paired OSL on sediments, and cross-checks from diagnostic imports. Non-destructive scanning, UXRF, portable XRF, petrography without cutting large samples, prefers preservation. When destructive sampling is needed, e.g., tiny samples for stable isotopes or proteomics, it should be minimal, justified, and done with local stakeholder agreement. A final methodological point is transparency and reproducibility. Publishing raw dates, contexts, and lab protocols allows independent verification and recalibration as techniques improve. Chronologies are living constructs. A well-documented 14C measurement from 990 can and should be reevaluated with updated calibration curves or improved stratigraphic understanding. Ethical note: sampling and community consent. Dating campaigns often require removing samples from contexts that communities might hold dear. Obtaining informed consent, explaining goals and consequences, and offering co-stewardship of data and fines are ethical prerequisites. Moreover, labs and researchers should ensure local museums and communities receive copies of reports and benefit from capacity building when possible. Soft reflection and transition. Dating is not the thrilling reveal in a single number. It is a patient process of building probabilistic scaffolds. When stratigraphy, radiocarbon, OSL, imported goods, isotopes, and biomolecular lines converge, they give us a robust map of time, one that places Great Zimbabwe's major building phases in the medieval window and ties its occupations to wider Indian Ocean rhythms. But each date arrives wrapped in uncertainty. Our job is to unpack, cross-check, and be honest about confidence. In the next part, we will follow the chemical traces, how isotopes and elemental fingerprints map mobility, diet, and trade networks, and then examine bioarchives like dental calculus and proteomics that reveal tiny, intimate details of life at the plateau. Settle in. Tonight we follow the invisible geographies written in atoms, the chemical traces that let us read mobility, trade, and diet across centuries. If Part 10 showed how we place events in time, this part shows how we place people and objects in space. The tools are isotopes and elemental fingerprints. They are not magical. They are careful measurements that, when paired with archaeology, open windows onto movement, connection, and economy. Strontium 87 Surrey 6er is the first and most familiar map. Strontium enters the human body through food and water. Its isotope ratio reflects the geology of the place where your childhood teeth formed. Unlike bone, tooth enamel forms in early life and then locks in that isotopic signature. Compare the enamel signal from an adult found at Great Zimbabwe with the local geology's strontium baseline. If they match, that person likely grew up locally. If they differ, you have evidence of childhood mobility, childhood somewhere else, adulthood at Great Zimbabwe. Applied to animals, cattle, sheep, strontium reveals herd movement and trade in live animals. The method is powerful, but not infinitely precise. Large regions can share similar strontium signatures, so the technique often tells you that a person is local to a geological province rather than pinning a precise village. Oxygen isotopes, D18O, add climatic geography. Oxygen in drinking water varies with elevation, precipitation, and distance from coasts. Tooth enamel oxygen ratios thus provide complementary signals to strontium. Together, Seinster plus O can narrow likely childhood regions. For example, distinguishing a lowland river valley signature from a high plateau one. But oxygen values are sensitive to local diets, breastfeeding practices, and climatic change. Interpretation demands careful baseline sampling and an understanding of local hydrology. Carbon, D13C, and nitrogen, D15N, isotopes speak to diet. The ratio of carbon isotopes distinguishes C3 plants, trees, many temperate cereals, from C4 plants, millet, sorghum, tropical grasses. A human bone or tooth collagen showing a strong C4 signal suggests substantial consumption of millet or sorghum. A mixed signal implies a diverse diet. Nitrogen isotopes help estimate trophic level. More animal protein pushes D15N higher. So, together C and N outline the balance of plant and animal foods in life. Applied to fauna, these isotopes reconstruct herd management and hunting practice. Limitations include hunting versus herding ambiguity and the need for good comparative samples from local fauna and plants. Lead isotopes and trace metals illuminate trade networks and craft inputs. Lead, Pb, isotope ratios vary with ore sources and can pin metal artifacts or pigments to particular mining regions. Elemental fingerprints, trace element suites and glass beads revealed by LAICP-MS, identify production recipes that cluster by workshop or region. A cobalt-rich blue glass with a South Asian trace signature tells a different trade story than a Mediterranean recipe. Portable XRF, PXRF surveys can rapidly screen many artifacts for elemental patterns. Lab-based mass spectrometry then refines provenance. Remember, chemistry points to likely sources and technological recipes. It rarely names an individual trader. Glass geochemistry is especially revealing for beads. Bead glass recipes carry telltale levels of soda, potash, magnesium, and certain trace elements. These compositional fingerprints, when compared to large reference data sets, place objects within broad technological families, e.g., plant ash glass from South Asia versus mineral soda glass from the Near East. Combine that with typology, how beads were made and cut, and you get a stronger provenance inference. Caveat: recycling and remelting can alter compositions. Objects sometimes undergo local finishing that changes surface chemistry without changing core composition. So, analysts use both bulk and surface-sensitive techniques. Sulfur isotopes, D34S, can help with marine versus terrestrial signals in diets and sometimes indicate proximity to coast-derived foods. Sulfur is less commonly used than carbon or nitrogen, but adds nuance when available. Similarly, sulfur and zinc traces in soils and residues can hint at specific craft activities, tanning, dyeing, or metalworking, if baseline comparisons are available. Residue chemistry extends beyond bones. Lipid analysis and proteomics on ceramic sherds detect absorbed animal fats, plant oils, or protein traces. Proteomic methods, studying ancient proteins, are robust in some warm contexts where DNA degrades too fast. Proteomics can identify dairy proteins, caseins, fish proteins, or specific plant proteins, revealing practices like milk use or fish processing even when bones are absent. Liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, LC-MS-MS, and GC-MS are the workhorses here. Again, contamination and post-depositional movement of molecules are real concerns. Clean sampling and good context are essential. Dental calculus, calcified plaque, is a tiny but rich archive. It traps micro debris, starch grains, phytoliths, proteins, and microbial DNA. When well preserved and carefully sampled, calculus reveals direct evidence of plant consumption, processing residues, and even occupational signatures, e.g., fiber dust for textile workers. Proteomics on calculus has identified species-specific proteins, sometimes pointing to what was chewed or cooked. The technique shines where bone collagen fails, but calculus preservation depends on local chemistry and burial conditions. It is not available in every sample. Ancient DNA, aDNA, remains tempting but challenging in tropical and subtropical contexts. Heat, humidity, and soil chemistry accelerate DNA breakdown. Where aDNA survives, it can revolutionize understanding, population affinities, ancestry, and even pathogen presence. But success rates are lower here than in cold or arid sites. Researchers therefore temper expectations. Proteomics and isotopes often provide more consistent returns in these climates. A crucial methodological principle is multi-proxy convergence. A single isotopic anomaly is interesting. A pattern of Cyr plus O plus C plus N plus elemental fingerprinting that points together to non-local origins is compelling. For instance, a tooth enamel with non-local Cyr plus O, bone collagen with higher D15N suggesting a richer diet in adulthood, and associated import goods in the same sealed context together tell a story of migration and social mobility. Chemistry builds probabilistic narratives, not absolute certainties. Uncertainty box, what chemistry cannot do alone. It cannot name a village or a ship. It cannot reveal intention, language, or sustained belief. It cannot substitute for archaeological context. Chemical data divorced from secure stratigraphy misleads. Recycling, contamination, dietary change, and regional overlap all complicate interpretation. Ethical notes, sampling and stewardship. Chemical analyses often require destructive sampling. Researchers should minimize sample size, use non-destructive scans first, and obtain informed consent from local stakeholders. Data sharing and co-interpretation with descendant communities ensure that science supports, rather than supplants, local heritage priorities. Soft reflection and transition. These chemical tools let us read movement in ways stones alone cannot. They convert silent travel into a pattern that human imagination can follow. Who moved here as a child? Which herds grazed across borders? And which beads came from a distant kiln? In the next part, we will look more deeply at bioarchives, dental calculus, proteomics, and the stubborn promise of aDNA, to read the microhistories of diet, health, and movement at Great Zimbabwe. Dim the lights a little more. Hold your curiosity like a soft lantern. We move now into the tiniest archives, molecules and microscopic debris trapped in human bodies and in the things people used. These bioarchives are the most intimate traces archaeology can recover. The food you chewed, the microbes that lived in your mouth, the proteins that soaked into a pot. When they preserve, they let us eavesdrop on ordinary life in extraordinary detail, but they are fragile. The methods are technical, the promise is great, and the constraints real. We will walk through what each archive can tell us, how scientists recover the signals, and where caution must temper excitement. Dental calculus, a tiny time capsule. Dental calculus is calcified dental plaque. Over a lifetime, a sticky microbial biofilm traps micro remains. Starch granules, phytoliths, plant silica bodies, tiny fragments of animal tissue, pigment particles, particles, and even traces of smoke. Over time, saliva mineralizes these deposits into a hard plaque that can last millennia under the right conditions. When archaeologists scrape and analyze calculus under the microscope, they can identify plant microfossils that signal consumption of certain cereals, tubers, or wild plants. For places like the Zimbabwe plateau, calculus sometimes reveals direct evidence of sorghum, millet, or tuber consumption, bits of starch or phytolith morphologies that fit known plant families. Calculus also preserves proteins and DNA, fragments of what people chewed, inhaled, or were exposed to. Proteomics and biomolecular sequencing applied to calculus can detect milk proteins, plant proteins, and even molecular signatures of oral pathogens. Importantly, calculus records not only diet but occupational and environmental exposures, tiny fibers from weaving, soot particles from smoke inhalation, or micro debris from stoneworking. In short, calculus offers a multi-purpose snapshot of lived experience, what you ate, what you breathed, and some of what you touched. Proteomics, reading proteins where DNA may fail. Proteomics refers to the study of ancient proteins. Proteins are more chemically robust than DNA in many warm and humid contexts. They often survive where DNA has long decayed. Techniques like liquid chromatography, tandem mass spectrometry, LC-MS-MS, identify peptide fragments and match them to modern reference proteins, giving species-level identifications in many cases. For example, casein peptides indicate dairy use. Particular collagen peptides can point to species of fish or domesticated animals. Plant proteins can sometimes identify cereals or legumes. Proteomic analysis works on a range of substrates: dental calculus, ceramic residues, bone, and even residues trapped in artifacts. In settings where aDNA preservation is poor, proteomics often provides the best molecular window into diet, dairy exploitation, and some craft use practices. Proteomic signals must be treated probabilistically. Peptide matches come with confidence scores and the possibility of cross-contamination. So, interpretation couples molecular results with archaeological context. Ancient DNA, aDNA, great potential, real constraints. Ancient DNA can answer questions about ancestry, population movement, pathogens, and even individual kinship when preservation allows. Teeth, especially the dense inner parts, and the petrous portion of the temporal bone are prime targets because they protect DNA molecules better than porous bone. When good aDNA is recovered, analyses can reveal genetic affinities, how groups relate to each other and to modern populations, and can detect admixture events and migrations. But in tropical and subtropical environments, aDNA preservation is highly variable. Heat and moistures accelerate DNA breakdown. That means success rates are lower than in cold, dry places. Researchers therefore enter aDNA projects with calibrated expectations. Success is possible but never guaranteed. When aDNA is recovered, strict authentication protocols apply. Damage patterns, short fragments, characteristic CT substitutions at molecule ends, duplication checks, and laboratory controls to exclude modern contamination. Metagenomic sequencing can also reveal ancient pathogens, but pathogen claims demand especially robust authentication because modern contamination is a constant hazard. Dental calculus and aDNA together, a productive pairing. Dental calculus can preserve small amounts of DNA and preserve proteins that aDNA can't. Combining calculus proteomics with aDNA from bone or tooth enamel gives complementary windows. Proteins tell what was eaten, aDNA tells who you were, and sometimes where you came from. Isotope data, CER-OCN, paired with molecular signals creates a multidimensional biography. Childhood geology, lifetime diet, microbial companions, and genetic ancestry. When multiple independent methods point in the same direction, interpretive confidence rises. Residue proteomics on ceramics. Cooking's molecular ghost pots absorb molecules. Fatty acids, proteins, and starch residues can lodge in a ceramic matrix and survive. Residue extraction followed by GCMS or LC-MS-EMS can detect lipid profiles indicating dairy, ruminant fats, or marine oils. Proteomic residues can identify species-level markers sometimes. Such results let us connect vessel types to their culinary roles. Which pots held porridge, which held milk, which served fish. Again, sample context and rigorous lab controls are crucial. Uncertainties and limits. A careful box, preservation bias. Warm, wet soils and acidic burial environments reduce biomolecule survival. Contamination. Modern proteins and DNA can infiltrate samples from handling, conservation treatments, or lab reagents. Taphonomic mixing. Residues move through soils. Secondary deposition complicates links between molecule and original use. Interpretive resolution. A protein match can indicate species presence but not necessarily quantity, frequency, or social valuation of a food. Representativeness. Individuals whose remains preserve calculus are a subset of the population. They may not reflect community-wide patterns. Ethical considerations. People before data bioarchaeological work touches human remains and living communities. Ethical practice requires informed consent where descendant groups are identified or involved, transparent communication about research goals and potential impacts, minimal invasive sampling and prioritization of non-destructive methods, local capacity building, and shared ownership of data and publications, sensitivity to cultural values regarding handling of ancestors. Molecular analyses produce digital data that can be reused. Researchers must agree with stakeholders on access, reuse, and long-term curation. Practical examples. Procedural calm. A typical study might proceed like this. Samples are selected from securely stratified contexts, calculus is scraped in a clean lab, aliquots are sent for microscopy, proteomics, and metagenomics under strict contamination controls. Residue samples from pottery receive lipid extraction and GCMS. aDNA sampling happens only when stakeholders approve and when preservation prospects justify it. Each analytical step includes blanks and controls. Results are reported with confidence intervals and raw data shared in open repositories when appropriate. Soft reflection and transition. Bioarchives are the most personal kind of archaeological evidence. They tell us what individuals ate, what bits of environment clung to them, and occasionally where they came from. They are powerful precisely because they are fragile. Fragile in preservation and fragile ethically. When handled with humility, transparency, and scientific rigor, they transform our sense of past lives from the architectural and economic to the directly human. In the next part, we will step back from molecules to mid-scale social questions. Uncertainties appear who lived where inside the stone circuits, and how can we trace social organization without overstating the evidence. We will examine domestic geographies, status indicators, and the archaeology of households. Sit quietly and imagine the plan of a single enclosure as an unfolded map. The wall is a boundary. Inside are hearths, post holes, storage pits, and the scattered debris of daily life. But what does that pattern mean about social organization? Did the hill complex hold rulers and administrators while the outer yards housed common households? Were enclosures household units, craft neighborhoods, ritual precincts, or some woven combination of these roles? These are the sorts of questions where archaeology is strongest at raising sharply focused uncertainties, and where we must be careful not to substitute tidy stories for messy evidence. First, the problem of reading space. Built features are durable, but their meanings shift. A paved platform can be a display area, a working surface, a store, or all three at different times. Hearths mark cooking, but also ceremony. Storage pits can indicate surplus management, seasonal caching, or even ritual deposition. The same physical footprint can have multiple social lives across decades. Thus, interpreting who lived where requires us to combine artifact distributions, ecofacts, architectural markers, and comparative reasoning about how households functioned in similar ecological and cultural settings. Patterns we do see are suggestive. Inside the hill complex and the Great Enclosure, archaeologists find denser concentrations of high-quality stonework, paved areas, and caches of worked soapstone and imported items. Peripheral areas show more diffuse domestic debris, sherds of cooking pots, spindle whorls, and animal bone middens. This spatial differentiation supports a working hypothesis. Some spaces were oriented toward display, elite consumption, or centralized functions, while others remained primarily domestic. But supports is not proves. We must also ask whether the presence of exotic goods necessarily signals elite residency, or whether such goods circulated widely enough to appear in ordinary courtyards over time. Households are not monoliths. A single compound might host an extended family with multiple related adult units. Labor was often pooled and reallocated across kin groups. So when we see a larger courtyard with several hearths, is that an elite household or simply an extended family compound with multiple cooking units? Ethno-historic analogies show both possibilities. In many African settings, domestic compounds organize around kin networks, where status is expressed through cattle holdings, grain stores, and the hosting of feasts rather than single architectural markers. Mapping status therefore demands moving beyond architecture into the material correlates of power, large grain stores, concentrations of prestige imports, specialized craft debris, or burial patterns that indicate differential wealth. Burials are informative but rare. Human interments near the complex, when present and well documented, can yield direct signals, grave goods, isotopic diets, and osteological markers of labor or health. Where high-status burials are clearly associated with particular enclosures, they provide a stronger case for social differentiation. Yet burial practices vary culturally and may not always place elites in conspicuous graves. Absence of rich burials in one area does not necessarily mean absence of social importance. People may honor their dead differently, or later reuse may remove burial contexts. Temporal layering complicates reading social space. Enclosures were built, modified, and reused over centuries. A space that was an elite platform in the 12th century might be a household cluster in the 14th. When we map artifact densities across a site without fine-grained chronological control, we risk merging occupations and mistaking diachronic change for synchronous social patterning. This is why secure stratigraphic sampling, paired radiocarbon or OSL dates, and context-specific analyses are essential before assigning stable social roles to places. Craft and production add another dimension. Workshop debris, slag, kiln wasters, bead production fragments, points to specialized activity. When such debris clusters near certain enclosures, we infer craft neighborhoods or household-based specialists. But craft can also be mobile. Itinerant smiths or beadworkers move tools and expertise across yards. The presence of specialized production does not automatically equal centralized control. It might reflect household entrepreneurship or seasonal intensification after harvests. Women's work is particularly invisible in architecture. Tasks like spinning, weaving, food preparation, and child care primarily use perishable tools and small artifacts that disperse into middens. Spindle whorls and grinding stones offer clues, but they do not map cleanly to architectural hierarchy. That invisibility risks biasing interpretations toward public, male-dominated spaces that leave bigger material signatures. A responsible reading requires us to weigh small finds. Spindle whorls, small pottery, and domestic debris, equally as evidence of economic and social importance. Power and redistribution are social processes that leave material footprints, feasting deposits, large hearths, or communal storage pits. Evidence for large-scale redistribution, stored grains used for emergency relief, host-provided goods in festival contexts, would indicate leaders who could mobilize resources. Identifying such deposits requires careful excavation of storage features, analysis of plant macro remains, and contextual checks for signs of mass consumption, large serving vessels, burnt layers from communal cooking. Ethics again arises. Sampling organic stores for dating or residue analysis should be minimally destructive and involve stakeholders. Uncertainty box. Core question we still cannot fully answer, and what would help? How sharply hierarchical was social organization at any one moment? What would help? A dense grid of securely dated household contexts, paired with burial analysis showing persistent differential grave goods and isotopic diet contrasts. Were the Hill Complex and Great Enclosure exclusive elite precincts or multifunctional centers used by many households over time? What would help? Stratified deposits that separate construction phases, high-resolution dating of floors, and spatial analyses linking specific artifact assemblages to discrete phases. How centralized was surplus control and redistribution? What would help? Direct evidence of large communal storage, sealed granaries, residue analyses showing mass food preparation, and documentary or oral parallels indicating institutionalized redistribution. What role did craft specialists play in social hierarchy, household-based or institutionally attached? What would help? Spatial clustering of workshop debris with associated habitational features, wear and isotopic markers on artisan skeletons, and microbotanical residues linking craft to trade networks. How representative are excavated samples of the broader region? What would help? Systematic regional survey paired with targeted test excavations to understand variability across satellite settlements. Ethical note. Sampling and representativeness, decisions about where to sample shape narratives. Prioritizing lofty, museum-worthy enclosures over peripheral habitations risks reinforcing an elite-centered history that may not reflect lived experience. Collaborative research agendas, co-designed with local communities, can help ensure that fieldwork addresses both scientific and social priorities. Soft reflection and transition. Uncertainty is not failure, it is a map of where to look next. Each question above is an invitation to targeted dating, to careful excavation of domestic spaces, to bioarchaeological sampling done with community consent. As we proceed, we will treat these unknowns as honest constraints that sharpen rather than diminish our narratives. In the next part, we will continue this thread of uncertainty by focusing on chronology debates, how different dating methods sometimes disagree, what that means, and how we rebalance interpretations when time itself is the contested terrain. Dim the lights, breathe in slowly, and let the question of time settle like dust motes in a sunbeam. We've already seen that dating a place like Great Zimbabwe is a mosaic. Stratigraphy, radiocarbon, luminescence, imported ceramic anchors, and bioarchives each contribute tiles. But sometimes those tiles don't fit perfectly. Different methods produce overlapping, but not identical pictures. This part lays out the main chronological debates, why they arise, and what kinds of evidence would help resolve them. We'll separate well-established consensus from open disputes and speculative proposals, so you can follow the reasoning clearly. Consensus first. The broad agreement among most specialists is that Great Zimbabwe's major building phases and dense occupation fall broadly within the medieval window, roughly the 11th through the 15th centuries CE. Multiple lines of evidence support this. Stratigraphic sequences that link local pottery styles to dated organic remains, radiocarbon measurements from hearths and seeds, and imported goods whose production spans medieval coastal kiln phases. That consensus anchors our narrative. This is a medieval, African-built, regionally integrated site. But within that window, scholars debate finer-grained timing. When did the major walls go up? When did the largest surges of craft production and long-distance exchange occur? Did construction happen in a short, intense burst, or in slow accretions over centuries? These are the margins where methods sometimes pull in different directions. Radiocarbon wiggles and sample choice. Radiocarbon dating is enormously useful, but it produces ranges, not single years. Calibration curves, required to convert radiocarbon years into calendar years, have plateaus and wiggles that widen the probable calendar ranges for certain centuries. This means that a dozen radiocarbon dates from hearth charcoal might cluster between, say, 1100 and 1350 C with overlapping ranges that can't be sensibly sharpened without more discriminating samples. Worse, if you date long-lived wood, timber with inner rings decades or centuries old, the sample may give an age older than the event you intend to date, the old wood problem. Short-lived samples, seeds, annual grasses, or carbonized food residues are preferable because they tie tightly to a single year or season of use. The debate often centers on whether studies used enough short-lived samples and whether sample contexts were truly sealed. OSL and construction fills, different clocks. Optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, dates when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight, which makes it useful for construction fills, buried floors, and sediments moved during building. OSL sometimes returns ages that differ from radiocarbon, because each method dates different events. OSL dates the burial of grains in the fill. Radiocarbon dates organic material that might predate the fill. If construction reused older sediments, or if fill material included redeposited grains, OSL ages can be older than the moment of wall erection. Interpreting OSL therefore requires careful understanding of depositional history. Debates arise when OSL suggests earlier construction phases, while radiocarbon or ceramic typology points later. Both can be right if one dated redeposited material and the other the construction episode. Imported ceramic anchors, the double edge of cross-dating. Diagnostic imported ceramics, especially Chinese porcelains with well-studied kiln chronologies, can provide helpful time markers. But these cross-dates assume that the imported piece entered the local deposit near the time it was made, and that typological attributions are correct. Porcelain fragments can be curated, traded for decades, or redeposited. Misreading their context leads to misdated layers. Some chronological debates hinge on whether certain imported sherds found in place were indeed primary deposits or later intrusions. Bayesian chronological modeling, smoothing the noise. Modern analysts use Bayesian statistics, e.g. an ox cow, to combine radiocarbon dates with stratigraphic information and priors about sequences. Bayesian models can shrink ranges and produce more precise chronologies, but they are model-dependent. The modeler's choices, which dates to include how to treat outliers, what priors to impose, influence results. Two well-intentioned teams may produce different Bayesian outputs from the same raw data if they make different assumptions. Thus, part of the debate is methodological: how to construct defensible models that transparently show assumptions and sensitivity. Residuality and mixing, the archaeological complication. Sites with long reuse histories create mixed deposits. A hearth might be dug into older occupation layers and incorporate older debris. Floors may be swept and reset, mixing material from different phases. These processes produce palimpsest contexts, where artifacts of different dates sit together. Disentangling palimpsests requires meticulous excavation, microstratigraphy, and, where possible, direct dating of discrete features. Chronology debates often reflect different interpretations of whether a sample came from a primary, sealed context, or from a mixed deposit. Interpretive consequences. Why does chronology matter beyond scholarly precision? Because it shapes narratives about social change. If a burst of building concentrates in the 12th century, one reads a phase of political centralization or elite-led projects. If construction is continuous from the 11th into the 15th century, the picture shifts to long-term accretion and adaptive reuse. If imported goods spike in a narrow window, that suggests intensified trade networks at particular moments. Therefore, resolving chronological questions affects how we imagine social organization, agonymy, and external connections. What would resolve debates? Practical suggestions. Several concrete strategies would greatly strengthen chronologies. Increase short-lived, context-secure samples. Prioritize carbonized seeds, individual nutshells, or short-lived plant remains directly associated with construction horizons or sealed floors. These reduce old wood bias. Pair methods on the same features. Where possible, take OSL samples from the same construction fills that yield radiocarbon samples, short-lived organics, and model them together. Convergence strengthens interpretation. Divergence becomes evidence to explain. Directly date use-related materials. AMS dating of residues, charred food crusts on pots or residues sealed under a floor, ties human activity to time more tightly than general charcoal. Publish raw data and lab protocols. Open datasets let multiple groups rerun Bayesian models, test sensitivity to assumptions, and build collective confidence. Transparency reduces disputes born of opaque methods. Expand regional sampling. Single-site chronologies are fragile. Broader comparative dating across satellite settlements can reveal whether patterns at Great Zimbabwe are local quirks or regional trends. Use microstratigraphy and micromorphology. Thin section analyses of floors and fills reveal construction events, trampling and redeposition invisible at coarser scales. Ethical note: sampling and stewardship. All increased sampling must be done with stakeholder consent, minimal destructiveness, and clear benefit sharing. Local curation of samples, training for local archaeologists, and co-authorship where appropriate. Chronology is a shared heritage. Methods should not treat samples as mere data points divorced from living communities. Soft reflection and transition. Chronology debates are not evidence of failure, but of scientific honesty. Methods have limits, and the gaps between them are where new insights are born. When radiocarbon, OSL, typology, and Bayesian models are used together, with careful attention to context and ethical sampling, the mosaic of time becomes clearer. For now, the big picture timing, medieval occupation, and extensive engagement with Indian Ocean exchange holds firm. The fine detail will continue to sharpen with collaborative, transparent work. In the next part, we will return to food and bones, the zoo archaeology of diet. What animal remains tell us about subsistence, status, and environment in the life world of Great Zimbabwe. Dim the lights once more. Lay the picture gently in your mind, a midden heap, bones half buried in ash and pottery sherds, the fingerprints of meals eaten long ago. Zoo archaeology turns those scattered bones into a conversation about what people ate, how they managed animals, and how diet intertwined with status, ritual, and environment. Bones do not only tell us what was on a plate, they record decisions about mobility, labor, and social value. Start with presence and proportion. At Great Zimbabwe and similar sites, faunal assemblages typically show a mix of domestic and wild species. Domesticates, particularly cattle, followed by goats, sheep, and chickens, feature prominently. Wild mammals, tortoises, and fish often appear as well. The relative abundance of these taxa matters. A site where cattle bones dominate tells a different economic story than one where small game is more common. Cattle are not merely sources of protein, they are economic capital and social currency. Their prominence in bone assemblages can therefore reflect both dietary preference and the social economy of wealth display, bride wealth, and ritual feasting. Age profiles reveal choices. When zoo archaeologists examine the age at death of animals using tooth eruption and wear, epiphyseal fusion in bones, and size, they see management strategies. A herd slaughtered mostly for young animals suggests a meat-focused economy, one where many older animals are kept, indicates emphasis on milk, traction, or breeding stock. Herd composition also hints at mobility. Cattle herded across wider terrains might show different body condition indicators than animals kept in more sedentary systems. Interpreting age profiles gives us insight into whether communities were keeping animals primarily for subsistence, exchange, or social capital. Butchery patterns read like instructions. Cut marks, chop marks, and fracture patterns show how animals were processed. Skilled butchery that separates joints cleanly suggests knowledge of efficient meat removal and perhaps specialist butchers. Conversely, burning patterns on bones, fractured shafts showing marrow extraction, or the presence of certain discarded elements can indicate household-level processing and more economical use of resources. Spatial context, where certain bone types cluster, helps distinguish domestic refuse from feasting debris or ritual depositions. Feasting and ritual leave distinctive signatures. Large, concentrated deposits of particular taxa, many cattle scapulae piled together, bones showing ceremonial breakage, can indicate communal feasting events. Such episodes are social performances. Leaders show generosity by sponsoring feasts, redistribute wealth, and reinforce alliances through the shared consumption of meat. Identifying feasting archaeologically requires careful context, large hearths, consumption of high-value cuts, and associated prestige items, beads, imported sherds, all strengthen the inference. Fish and aquatic resources are a quieter but important thread. Their presence indicates connections to rivers and lowlands or trade in dried fish. Fish bones are fragile and often underrepresented due to preservation biases. Yet when they appear, they expand our understanding of diet breadth and trade in perishable goods. Shellfish, too, may show up as beads or as dietary remains, and their species composition can point to coastal contacts or inland exploitation of freshwater systems. Environmental signals live in the bones. Stable isotope analysis on animal bones reveals feeding regimes, whether animals grazed on C4 grasses, tropical grasses, or consumed browse and C3 plants. Changes in isotope values over time can reflect environmental shifts, drier conditions favoring C4 grasses, or human management decisions like herding in particular pastures. Zoo archaeological assemblages, when paired with paleo-environmental data, help reconstruct the pastoral and agricultural landscape that sustained settlement. Health and workload appear in skeletons. Pathologies on animal bones, arthritic changes, healed fractures, or signs of poor nutrition indicate use life. A high prevalence of pathologies in draft animals suggests intensive traction use. Dental pathology in domesticated species can reflect diet quality. These markers tell us about animal welfare, the intensity of labor demands, and the economic calculus driving animal use. Taphonomy and preservation caveats must be kept always in view. Bone survival depends on soil acidity, burial depth, and post-depositional processes. Small, fragile bones, like those of birds and fish, may be underrepresented. Differential preservation can bias interpretations. An apparent emphasis on cattle might partly reflect the better survivability of large mammal bones. Zoo archaeologists use quantification methods: NISP, number of identified specimens, MNI, minimum number of individuals, and measures of bone weight, to mitigate these biases and to make cautious inferences. Social inequality and diet. Human skeletal remains, when accessible and ethically studied, offer a mirror to social differentiation. Isotopic signals in human bone collagen reveal protein and plant consumption patterns. Higher D15N values can indicate greater reliance on animal protein. If isotopic analyses show consistent dietary differences between individuals associated with different enclosures, some with higher meat and dairy signatures, others with lower, that pattern supports interpretations of social stratification. But sampling must be representative and respectful. Human remains demand rigorous ethical frameworks and community consent. Uncertainty box. Zoo archaeology's primary open questions here. How much of domestic animal production supplied local consumption versus long-distance trade and tribute? Better answered by combining herd age profiles with spatial distribution of butchery waste and comparative isotope baselines from surrounding satellite sites. Were feasts frequent political tools or rare ceremonial events? Clarify with high-resolution excavation of large communal deposits, direct dating of feasting layers, and linkage to artifact assemblages signaling prestige. How did environmental variability change pastoral strategies over the centuries? Resolve through serial sampling of faunal isotopes across stratified sequences aligned with paleo-environmental cores. To what extent did imported goods, e.g., salt, preserved fish, alter dietary patterns? Investigate with residue analyses on cooking vessels and molecular traces indicating non-local foods. Ethical note. Handling animal remains and human-associated samples, faunal remains, are part of cultural heritage. Analysis plans should include local stakeholder consultation, clear curation pathways for remains, and capacity building so that local institutions can steward and interpret assemblages. Where human bones are involved, researchers must adhere to strict ethical protocols, including community permissions, transparent objectives, and sensitive reporting. Soft reflection and transition. Bones are both blunt evidence and eloquent witnesses. They tell us what was eaten, how animals were managed, and how social life used food as a medium of politics and identity. Yet, they are shaped by preservation and by human choice. When we read them carefully, paired with isotopes, context, and comparative regional data, we see not only diet but the socio-political rhythms of a community that fed itself, celebrated together, and maintained herds that were at once bread and bride wealth. In the next part, we will turn from past diets to present duties, conservation, modern heritage management, and the voices shaping how Great Zimbabwe is preserved and presented today. Dim the lights and take a long, steady breath. The stones we have been following through time now stand in the light of modern responsibilities. Conservation is not a technical sidebar, it is part of the story. How we treat Great Zimbabwe today shapes what future generations will see, touch, and remember. This part looks calmly at the practical, ethical, and social dimensions of protecting and presenting the site, stabilizing fragile walls, negotiating who tells the story, sharing benefits with local people, and preparing for slow threats like climate and fast ones like theft. Principle first, do no harm. Conservation begins with the basic idea that interventions should be minimal, reversible when possible, and compatible with original materials and techniques. For dry stone masonry, that usually means repair strategies that respect the original method, fitting replacement stones carefully rather than using modern cement that can trap moisture and accelerate decay. Consolidation and stitching of unstable sections should be done by skilled masons using compatible materials and documented methods so that future conservators understand what was changed and why. Preventive conservation is as important as reactive repair. Vegetation management keeps roots from prying stones apart and reduces moisture retention against walls. Drainage control prevents water pooling at foundations. Visitor routing, clear paths, simple barriers, and interpretive signage reduces trampling and accidental damage. Monitoring programs that check wall movement, lichen growth, and erosion provide early warning, so small interventions avoid larger crises. These are mundane tasks, but they are the ones that keep monuments standing through years and seasons. Documentation underpins all good conservation. High-resolution photography, detailed drawing, and increasingly, digital 3D photogrammetry create permanent records of structure and condition. A fully documented model allows conservators to test interventions virtually, provides forensic context for later researchers, and supports insurance and legal processes if damage occurs. Digital archives should be curated locally, as well as in national repositories, with accessible backups and clear protocols for long-term stewardship. Community engagement is not optional, it is central. The people who live around Great Zimbabwe are the stewards of its meanings. Conservation plans work best when they are co-designed. Local stakeholders participate in deciding priorities, in daily care, and in interpreting the site for visitors. That participation takes many forms: employment as guides and conservators, training programs in site maintenance, co-curated exhibits in nearby museums, educational programs for local schools, and equitable sharing of tourism revenues. When local jobs and capacity building are part of conservation, heritage becomes a living economy rather than an extractive one. Interpretation needs plurality. The stories presented to visitors should include archaeological findings, oral histories, and contemporary community perspectives. Museums and site panels that place archaeological evidence alongside local memory create a richer narrative and counter older single-voice histories that sidelined indigenous knowledge. Interpretation materials should be produced in local languages, as well as in languages visitors expect. Audio guides, community-curated displays, and rotating exhibits can amplify voices that were historically silenced. Repatriation and collection stewardship deserve careful attention. Many artifacts from Great Zimbabwe and comparable sites reside in foreign museums and private collections. Ethical stewardship calls for transparent inventories, negotiated loans, and, where appropriate, repatriation. These processes require diplomacy, legal clarity, and institutional willingness. Wherever artifacts remain abroad, museums should collaborate with local institutions to enable research access, digital repatriation, high-resolution imaging and shared databases, and traveling exhibits that return objects temporarily for display and community benefit. Research governance matters. Scientific studies, especially those requiring destructive sampling, tiny material biopsies for dating, isotope work, or proteomics, must proceed only with transparent consent processes, community consultation, and benefit sharing. Sampling plans should minimize damage, explain why each sample is needed, and offer capacity building, training local scientists, sharing data openly, and co-authoring publications. Ethical practice treats communities as collaborators, not mere audiences for research results. Tourism offers both opportunity and risk. Visitor income can fund conservation and community projects. Unregulated tourism can erode fragile features, create trash problems, and commodify heritage in ways that distort meaning. Good tourism management balances access and protection, limit visitor numbers in sensitive areas, provide durable walkways, offer engaging but truthful interpretation, and reinvest a significant share of fees into local infrastructure and conservation staff wages. Revenue sharing agreements should be clear and routinely audited so that benefits are visible and sustainable. Security and legal frameworks must protect against looting and illicit trade. Local monitoring, trained community wardens, regular patrols, and clear reporting channels, combined with legal measures and international cooperation, helps deter theft. Transparent provenance documentation and public inventories reduce the marketability of looted objects. Wherever objects have left the country under dubious circumstances, controlled recovery and restitution pathways should be explored. Climate and slow threats deserve planning. Increasingly irregular rainfall, vegetation shifts, and extreme events, heavy downpours that provoke erosion, or long droughts changing vegetation cover, can stress masonry and site soils. Conservation plans should include climate adaptation measures, erosion buffers, tree management aligned with ecological goals, and scenario planning for extreme weather events. Funding mechanisms, endowments, dedicated government allocations, or tourism surcharges help ensure long-term resilience. Education and capacity building are investments that pay back. Training programs for local conservators, archaeological technicians, museum curators, and site managers create local expertise and reduce dependency on outside teams. Scholarships, internships, and collaborative field seasons where local students play central roles build trust and transfer skills. Shared authorship in publications and co-led exhibitions acknowledges contributions and shifts authority into the hands of those most affected. Ethical note: Intangible heritage and oral histories. Stonework is public. Oral histories and ritual associations are often personal and community held. Conservators should protect both physical fabric and intangible meanings. Recording oral histories, supporting local ceremonies, and respecting requests about access to certain spaces honor living heritage that cannot be preserved by stone alone. Soft reflection and transition. Conservation is at once technical and moral. It requires stonemason skill, archivists' care, conservators' science, and local communities' knowledge. When these strands come together, when intervention is minimal, documentation thorough, and governance collaborative, the site remains a teaching place and a living emblem. The next part will return to the little soapstone bird, re-examining the evidence about its meanings in light of both archaeological data and local memory. We will balance symbolic readings with the material facts and listen for how communities today continue to hear these small objects. Hold the small bird again in your mind. Imagine its curve under a fingertip, the polish where hands have smoothed its flank, the small chip at the beak that tells of long use. In the archaeology of Great Zimbabwe, these soapstone birds keep returning as one of the clearest, most charged motifs, simple in form, complex in meaning. Tonight we trace the many threads that tie bird objects to practice, where they are found, how they were made, how they were handled, and what living people today say about them. We will weigh symbolic interpretations against hard material indicators and keep uncertainty visible at every turn. Start with distribution and context. Soapstone birds occur primarily in association with the hill complex and the Great Enclosure, though they also appear at satellite settlements in smaller numbers. Archaeological reports note concentrations, ledge placements, caches within courtyard fills, and occasional deposits in floor layers. Their contexts vary. Some are in sealed domestic layers, some appear in what look like curated caches, and a handful are found in contexts interpreted as high status or public facing. This spatial pattern is important. Frequent appearance in central, architecturally prominent spaces suggests that the birds were more than trivial toys. They were meaningful within certain social circuits. Production evidence tells us about skill in workshops. The birds are most often carved from steatite, soapstone, which is soft and workable. Microscopic analysis shows pecking and abrasion marks, consistent with percussive roughing, followed by finer grinding and polishing. Some birds share stylistic templates, similar body proportions, beak shapes, and base treatments, hinting at shared models or apprenticeships. At some satellite sites, unfinished preforms and tool debris indicate local carving activity. At others, finished birds appear without local production waste, suggesting exchange. The pattern implies both local manufacture and wider stylistic norms circulating across a cultural horizon. Wear and use wear patterns are revealing. Under magnification, many birds show polish on specific surfaces that correspond to handling, bases smoothed by resting against palms, slight edge rounding on beaks from contact, micro abrasions consistent with threading or mounting. A subset shows residue traces, microscopic organic films that, when analyzed, sometimes yield traces consistent with plant oils or ochre pigments. These indicators suggest the birds were handled, possibly anointed, sometimes painted, and perhaps displayed on persons or platforms. The wear is not uniform. While many are well worn, suggesting long-term handling, some are pristine, perhaps curated for special deposition or ritual. Symbolic readings are broad but constrained by evidence. Birds often serve as metaphors in human cultures, for communication between worlds, for ancestor messengers, for rain or fertility. Ethnographic parallels from southern African oral traditions occasionally link avian imagery to royal insignia or to spiritual intermediaries, but direct one-to-one mappings are risky. Archaeology asks, what does the material pattern allow us to say confidently? The concentration of birds in elite architectural spaces and their presence alongside prestige imports are consistent with a role in status performance, insignia, or visible markers of office. Their portability and recurrence in household contexts also allow for personal and domestic uses, amulets, household talismans, or markers of lineage. The most defensible interpretation is plural. The birds likely functioned in multiple social registers, public display, personal insignia, ritual offering, depending on time and place. Ritual deposition and curated caches complicate meaning. Deposits of multiple birds, 2, 3, or more, found together in ledges or sealed pits suggest deliberate grouping. Such caches may be offerings associated with construction events, inaugurations of platforms, or ritual acts meant to consecrate spaces. The placement of birds on ledges facing inward into courtyards suggests an audience for their presence. They were meant to be seen, recognized, and perhaps to mark belonging. But deliberate placement also raises questions about intentional breaking, replacement, or curation. Were older birds ritually retired and set aside? Did birds circulate in cycles of use, repair, and deposition? Microscopic traces and the occasional repair evidence speak to long use lives and curated behavior. Comparative iconography nudges interpretation but does not dictate it. Elsewhere in the region and on the Swahili coast, bird imagery appears in different media: bead patterns, carved ivory pieces, and textile motifs. These parallels reveal shared symbolic repertoires across trade networks, but do not prove identical meanings. We must consider that bird shapes can be formalized into sign systems that travel independently of any single semantic load. A bird could be an emblem of lineage in one place, a fertility token in another, and a craft market souvenir in a third. Archaeology's role is to map correlations, context, wear, associated goods, rather than assert single, universal meanings. Oral histories and modern voices bring the past into present dialogue. Descendant communities and local custodians sometimes attribute ancestral and spiritual significance to soapstone birds. They may see them as anchors of lineage memory, as objects connected to rainmaking or leadership, or as elements in stories passed across generations. These living perspectives cannot be merely used as data points. They are interpretive partners. Oral memory can preserve functional hints, e.g., these were place markers, or embed symbolic horizons, e.g., the birds speak with ancestors, that, when triangulated with archaeological patterns, strengthen plausible readings. Importantly, oral testimony can also highlight forms of knowledge absent in material records: ceremonies, songs, and protocols connected to the objects. Scientific approaches add nuance. Residue proteomics and microbotanical tests on some birds have recovered traces of organic compounds, pigments, plant oils, consistent with anointing or painting. Use-wear studies demonstrate habitual handling, and spatial statistics confirm clustering in specific precincts. None of these techniques yields a single narrative, but together they create a multi-evidential portrait. Birds were made, handled, displayed, sometimes anointed and occasionally cached. They moved across households and precincts and participated in the social choreography of the site. Ethical note: display, curation, and local authority. Soapstone birds are living heritage. Decisions about who holds them, who displays them, and how they are interpreted should belong primarily to local communities. Museums and researchers should prioritize loans, shared exhibitions, and community-led interpretation. Where birds have left their place into foreign collections, negotiated loans, digital repatriation, and collaborative exhibitions can restore context and meaning. Destructive testing on these artifacts must be minimal and consensual, soft reflection and transition. The soapstone birds do not yield a single truth. They are polyvalent, worn by hands and layered with meanings that shift across contexts. They are at once intimate and public, objects small enough to hold, large enough to mark a place. In the next part, we will widen our lens to the broader region. Neighboring polities, satellite settlements, and the political landscapes that shaped interactions across the plateau and beyond. Dim the lights, breathe, and imagine the plateau not as an isolated island, but as the hub of a constellation. Great Zimbabwe sits at the center of many smaller settlements, satellite hamlets, and productive hinterlands. It was not a lone city-state, but part of a regional system of production, exchange, and politics. To understand its power, we must widen our view. Look at the landscape of satellites, the networks of patronage, the flow of cattle and gold, and the ways polity and place braided together across space. Settlement hierarchy first. Around the great stone circuits are numerous smaller communities, clusters of huts, small enclosures, and field systems. These satellite settlements vary in size and complexity. Some are compact farmsteads with simple hearths and storage pits. Others are larger compounds with paved surfaces, craft debris, and concentrations of imported items. This variability suggests a settlement hierarchy where Great Zimbabwe likely functioned as a regional node concentrating ritual, administrative, and redistributive roles, while satellites supplied food, craft inputs, and manpower. The spatial logic matches many pre-modern systems. A central place orders and markets goods and labor, while peripheries produce surpluses and maintain social ties. Control of resources underpins influence. The plateau's hinterland provided key resources: cattle pastures, arable pockets for sorghum and millet, woodlands for charcoal and construction, and mineral locales for gold and workable stone. Control over those resource patches matters politically. If a central authority could mobilize labor for stonework, feed seasonal building teams, or direct trade caravans to particular markets, that authority exercised practical power. But control here is often relational rather than absolute. Leaders might command allegiance through ritual status, redistribution, marriage alliances, or negotiated patronage rather than through centralized bureaucracies of the kind more familiar from written states. Regional politics are knotty and dynamic. Over centuries, power centers shift. Sites that are prominent early may wane as roots shift, as environmental conditions change, or as new polities reorganize networks. Mapungubwe, for example, is an earlier regional center whose rise and decline ripple into the story of the plateau. Later, the Shona polities and the Mutapa state emerge in different configurations. These shifts remind us that Great Zimbabwe is one node in a long array of political reorganization across southern Africa. Power is mobile. It follows trade, social alliances, and environmental opportunity. Trade networks are regional and interregional. Local exchange linked farmers, smiths, and traders to central nodes. Pastoral mobility, seasonal movement of herds, connects more remote grazing grounds to markets. Craft specialists travel between compounds to finish goods. Porters carry gold or ivory toward river valleys and onward to coastal intermediaries. The pattern is not one linear corridor, but a braided set of routes that change with rainfall, conflict, and market demand. That flexibility helps explain how inland communities maintain ties with coastal towns, even without direct shoreline access. Competition and cooperation coexist. Neighboring polities might compete over grazing rights, mine access, or control of particular trade nodes. Conflicts could take the form of raiding, negotiated fines, or marriage alliance pressures. At the same time, interpolity marriages, ritual reciprocity, and shared crafts bind communities together. Competition spurs centralization in some moments, when leaders consolidate resources to defend or project power, while cooperation sustains long-term exchange and cultural continuity. Craft and specialization are regionally distributed. Not every settlement needed a full slate of specialists. Pottery might be made in many households. Iron smelting could cluster at resource-adjacent sites. Carved soapstone objects might concentrate near centers with access to steatite sources or skilled carvers. This division of labor allows economies of scale. A specialized craftsman serving multiple villages increases efficiency while reinforcing interdependence. It also creates routes of movement for knowledge. Apprentices travel, styles diffuse, and standardized production techniques spread across the landscape. The archaeological imprint of regional connections is measurable. Satellite sites share pottery styles, bead typologies, and house forms that point to shared social repertoires. Isotopic studies on animals can show where herds grazed across seasons. Strontium analyses on human teeth can reveal migration patterns between hinterland hamlets and central precincts. Distribution maps of imported goods, beads, Chinese sherds, or coastal ceramics help us see which nodes had privileged access to long-distance trade and which were mainly producers for local circuits. Polity formation is not only material, it is performative. Leaders create authority through ritual display, gift-giving, and ceremonies that attract people from far afield. Feasting, public performance, and the hosting of traders consolidates a center's symbolic power. The Great Enclosure, the hill complex, and elevated platforms likely served such performative functions. By staging grand events, redistributing imported goods, presiding over marriages, or conducting ancestor rites, leaders materialized legitimacy and bound various communities into a polity's orbit. Environmental and economic feedback loops matter. Droughts, shifts in river courses, or deforestation could alter grazing routes and crop yields, ripple into trade flows, and prompt political reorientation. Conversely, booming trade in gold or ivory could attract more migrants, increase wealth concentration, and spur larger building projects. The region is an adaptive system. Ecology and economics interlock with politics and ritual. Uncertainty box. Regional questions still open. How centralized was control across the hinterland? Were leaders at Great Zimbabwe able to command resources across the whole plateau, or did they rely on negotiated, patchy authority? What would help? Systematic regional survey, linked chronologies across satellites, and isotopic work on human and livestock mobility. Which satellite settlements specialized in which crafts or resources? What would help? Intensive test excavations, microstratigraphic sampling of suspected workshop areas, and chemical sourcing of production wastes. How did political change on the coast affect inland organization? What would help? Synchronized chronologies between coastal kiln productions and inland import concentrations, and documentary comparisons where available. Oral memory and political identity shape the region today. Descendant communities remember relationships among places in ways that complement material records. Stories of migration, lineages tied to specific hills, and ritual obligations that trace old routes. Listening to these voices enriches the archaeological map and reframes political boundaries as living histories rather than static lines on a modern map. Ethical note. Regionally informed research. Regional studies should be designed and implemented with local partners across communities and institutions. Survey teams must share results widely, support local museum curation, and build capacity for regional interpretation so that narratives do not become the property of distant institutions alone. Soft reflection and transition. Viewed regionally, Great Zimbabwe becomes less a solitary wonder and more a busy pivot, a place that aggregated wealth, hosted ritual dramas, and linked upland lifeways to coastal networks. Politics here is iterative, built on networks, negotiated authority, and environmental opportunity. In the next part, we will listen more closely to oral history itself, how living memory remembers the site, what stories communities tell, and how those narratives shape and are shaped by archaeological practice. Dim the lights and lean in a little closer. Stones speak slowly. People remember in different tempos. Oral history is the living river that runs alongside the archaeological record. It is not a substitute for stratigraphy or isotopes, but it is a vital companion. Memory carries names, songs, ceremonies, genealogies, and localized understandings of place that artifacts alone cannot supply. Tonight we sit with those voices and consider how they shape, correct, and enrich our sense of Great Zimbabwe. What oral history gives us first is context. Elders and community historians carry narratives about lineages, about who used which hill, about customary duties attached to particular places. They recall ceremonies once held on certain platforms, gifts exchanged with visiting traders, and rules for entering sacred precincts. Those memories may preserve kernels of events that predate colonial archives. When material evidence seems partial, oral testimony often supplies the human motivations behind depositions, caches, or construction episodes. In other words, archaeology tells how something was done. Oral history helps explain why. Collecting oral history is a craft that requires humility and protocol. It begins with permission. Researchers approach communities through recognized local leaders and cultural custodians, explain purposes clearly, and secure informed consent, not once, but as an ongoing conversation. Interviews are best conducted in local languages with trusted intermediaries or co-researchers from the same community. Open-ended questions invite stories rather than testable answers. Tell me about this place, or what stories did your grandparents tell about the stones, rather than when was this built? The difference matters. Stories tend to encode relational memories, not calendar years, and they reveal values, obligations, and ceremonial scripts. Techniques matter. Free listing elicits the range of place-associated names and terms. Narrative interviews recover longer memories and event sequences. Life histories situate an individual across decades. And participatory mapping lets people draw routes, sacred groves, and resource patches as they remember them. Recording, audio, and, when consented, video, preserves tone, cadence, and performance elements, songs, chants, that text alone cannot. Transcription and translation should be collaborative. Native speakers verify meanings, idioms, and metaphors to avoid silent distortions. Importantly, communities must control how recordings are archived and who may access them. Oral histories are community property, not researcher trophies. Triangulation is the researcher's honest tool. An elder's memory of a ritual tied to a particular platform becomes stronger evidence when it aligns with archaeological features, altars, caches, or repeated deposits, or with historical accounts recorded in independent sources. Where memories contradict material patterns, we should not reflexively dismiss one or the other. Memory itself shifts over time. Ritual practices may relocate, or meanings adapt. Those inconsistencies are themselves data. They tell us about cultural change, reinvention, and resilience. Oral narratives also surface intangible heritage, names, cosmologies, and protocols that archaeology cannot excavate. For instance, a story about who may enter a courtyard or which clan supervises certain rites is crucial for contemporary site management. Conservation plans that ignore those protocols risk harming living traditions and provoke community alienation. Conversely, integrating oral accounts into interpretation panels, guided tours, and museum exhibits creates a richer and more ethically sound public history. Memory is political. Whose stories get recorded, who is invited to speak, and which versions are prioritized matters. Communities are not monolithic. Different lineages preserve different memories, and those memories can reflect historical rivalry as much as continuity. Researchers should therefore sample widely within communities, seek representative voices, including women, youth, and less prominent lineages, and avoid amplifying only those narratives that fit researchers' preconceptions. Transparent reporting of whose voices are included and whose are not is part of methodological integrity. Temporal framing in oral history requires sensitivity. People often anchor events through relative measures, before the big drought, in my grandfather's time, when trade pickled up. Translating these anchors into calendar dates requires triangulation with archaeological chronologies, written records where available, and regional environmental histories. It is a careful, negotiated exercise, not a mechanical conversion. Ethical stewardship of oral materials is central. Communities decide how their stories are used. Agreements should specify who owns recordings, who may quote them in publications, how anonymization is handled where requested, and how community benefits accrue. Copies of recordings, museum displays, local language publications, or educational materials. Compensation for time, recognition of intellectual contributions, and opportunities for community co-authorship respect the labor of memory keepers. Oral history also reveals continuity in ritual practice and symbolic life. Ceremonies that persist, rainmaking rituals, clan gatherings at named kopjes, songs about ancestors, link present communities to past landscapes. Where rituals continue on the same stones, the archaeological and living records overlap in a way that enriches both. Where rituals moved, memories explain the shift. New roads, changed political boundaries, or colonial displacement. These dynamics tell us how people adapt heritage to new conditions without losing its core meanings. There are limits and cautions. Memory can conflate, compress, or displace events. Trauma, migration, or colonial disruption alters recollection. Oral histories are not infallible chronologies. They are human narratives shaped by motive and mnemonic habit. The proper approach treats them as crucial qualitative data to be integrated with, not supplanted by, material and documentary evidence. A final practice note: co-curation. The recording of oral histories should lead to shared outputs that communities value: oral history archives under local custody, school curricula rooted in local narratives, community exhibitions, and digital repositories controlled by local institutions. Research that extracts stories without returning accessible forms of knowledge deepens historical injustice. Co-curation reverses that trend. Soft reflection and transition. Listening is an ethical act as much as a scientific one. Oral histories breathe life into the material record. They animate names, rituals, and responsibilities that stones alone cannot speak. When recorded, stored, and presented with consent, they become living resources for communities and scholars alike. In the next part, we will gather the explicit ethical notes that must guide sampling, display, mobility of artifacts, and the stewardship of both physical and intangible heritage. Practical rules for doing archaeology well and respectfully. Dim the lights, breathe slowly, and place your attention gently on responsibility. This part gathers the explicit ethical rules and practical steps that should guide every researcher, conservator, museum, and visitor who works with Great Zimbabwe and places like it. Ethics here is not an add-on. It is the lens through which we choose what to sample, how to display objects, and how to tell stories. Treat this as a compact protocol you can return to: rights, permissions, minimal harm, and shared benefit. Principle of prior and ongoing consent. Start with people. Before any fieldwork, researchers must obtain prior informed consent from relevant local authorities and community custodians. Not just a one-off signature, but an ongoing, documented process. Consent should be informed. Clear aims, methods, risks, and benefits. Voluntary and revisitable at every project stage. Where multiple communities or lineages claim custodianship, build a consultative process that records diverse voices and resolves differences transparently. Community partnership, not extraction design, projects as partnerships. Co-create research questions, invite local collaborators as co-investigators, and share leadership roles. Field supervisors, lab partners, co-authors. Budget for local hires, training, and infrastructure. Local labs, storage, conservation supplies. Research outputs should include community-facing products, summarized reports in local languages, educational materials for schools, and digital physical copies of archives returned to community institutions. Minimal destructive sampling and scientific justification. Destructive analyses, AMS radiocarbon, isotope sampling, aDNA, proteomics, must be justified by clear research questions that cannot be answered otherwise. Adopt a least damage approach. Sample tiny aliquots, prefer non-destructive imaging first, and pilot test on already damaged or small items when possible. Describe sampling strategies in advance and seek co-approval. Maintain records of sample locations, masses removed, chain of custody, and final disposition. Human remains. Respect, protocol, and return. Human remains require the highest standards. Only sample human bone or teeth when essential and after community consultation and, where feasible, formal permissions, including burial custodians and national authorities. Apply strict contamination controls and minimal destructive protocols. Discuss plans for reburial, display, or curation before work begins. Data derived from human remains, genetic, isotopic, should be shared with communities under agreed terms and should not be used in ways that stigmatize or harm descendant groups. Transparent provenance and collections ethics. Inventory and publish clear provenance records for artifacts. When artifacts in foreign and private collections derive from the site, pursue transparent communication, document acquisition histories, seek negotiated loans or repatriation, and prioritize collaborative exhibitions. Museums and collectors should assist in provenance research and refrain from displaying objects without contextual information and community consultation. Intellectual property, data governance, and access. Agree in advance on data governance. Who owns digital data sets, 3D models, radiocarbon dates, genetic sequences? Who may access them, and under what terms? Favor open access for scientific data, but respect community wishes for sensitive data sets, e.g., human aDNA, sacred narratives. Use controlled access repositories when necessary, and provide community copies of digital resources in accessible formats. Benefit sharing and economic equity. Design benefit sharing plans that deliver tangible returns. Employment, capacity building workshops, co-managed tourism revenues, scholarships for local students, and support for local museums. Avoid tokenism. Budget real, recurring funds into local conservation and community development projects agreed upon by stakeholders. Interpretation and display. Plural voices, exhibits, and site panels should reflect multiple narratives, archaeological evidence, oral histories, and contemporary community perspectives. Use local languages and inclusive storytelling. When displaying sacred or sensitive items, seek prior permission and consider restricted or contextualized display that respects ritual confidentiality. Tourism, access, and protection ethics. Manage tourism to protect fabric and social values. Establish visitor codes, route planning to avoid sensitive spots, and clear signage co-produced with local communities. Ensure that a meaningful portion of tourism income funds both conservation and community needs. Resist commercial pressures that commodify ritual or exploit community members for photo ops without consent. Legal and international norms adhere to national laws and international conventions, e.g., UNESCO principles, about cultural property, looting, and illicit trade. Report suspicious antiquities trafficking and support provenance research. Institutions must implement due diligence before acquiring artifacts or data. Digital and visual ethics. When photographing or digitizing sites, people, and objects, obtain permissions for images and define usage terms. For recordings of oral histories and rituals, respect requests for anonymity or restricted circulation. Digitization must not substitute for physical repatriation where communities request it. Conflict sensitivity and social justice. Be attentive to local politics. Archaeological projects can intensify rival claims over land or lineage. Conduct conflict sensitivity assessments, avoid actions that inflame disputes, and design governance structures that minimize elite capture of benefits. Ensure that marginalized voices, women, youth, minority lineages, are included in consultations. Capacity building and long-term commitment. Short-term projects can leave damage without local capacity to manage it. Commit to multi-year capacity building, train local conservators, help establish record-keeping systems, and support local museums in cataloging and conservation. Where possible, build institutional links, universities, heritage agencies that outlast any single grant. Ethical publication and authorship credit community contributors appropriately. Invite local scholars and custodians as co-authors and co-presenters. When writing for academic or popular audiences, avoid extractive language and clearly state ethical practices undertaken. Share preliminary findings with communities before public release to avoid surprises. Contingency and exit plans. Every project must include contingency plans. What happens to samples and records if funding ends, how collections are secured, and how community partners are supported if researchers depart. Define a transparent exit strategy that ensures local institutions retain access to materials and knowledge. Practical checklist for a responsible project. Brief. Written consent and memorandum of understanding with local custodians. Sampling plan with minimal destructive protocols and community sign-off. Budget lines for local hires, training, and benefit sharing. Data governance statement and repository agreements. Conservation plan with reversible interventions and local masons trained. Public outreach outputs in local languages. Community access to data. Security and repatriation plan for artifacts and sensitive materials. Soft reflection and transition ethics reshapes what we study and how we tell it. It turns archaeology from a search for answers into a shared practice of stewardship. When projects begin with consent, minimize harm, and share benefits, the stones remain standing and the stories remain alive, held respectfully by those who live with them. In the final part, we will pull together a gentle closing. Stones, trade, myth, what Great Zimbabwe teaches us about continuity, responsibility, and the human need to remember. Dim the lights. Take one long, slow breath and let it out. We have walked together across ridge and courtyard, peered into hearths, listened to birds carved in stone, and traced the thin chemical threads that tie inland hands to distant oceans. We have kept company with ancient builders, traveling traders, craft specialists, and modern custodians. Now, gently, we fold the map in and listen for what the stones want us to learn, not as a final verdict, but as an invitation to ongoing care. What the stones taught us, simply, at the heart of Great Zimbabwe lies a clear set of lessons that resist dramatic headlines, but reward patience. First, the place is an achievement of skillful people. The dry stone walls, the conical tower, the soapstone birds, all visible testimony that local communities between roughly the 11th and 15th century CE designed, built, maintained, and lived within a complex social landscape. Second, this inland world was connected. Glass beads, Chinese ceramics, and exotic materials, not the sum total of life here, but meaningful threads, show that trade routes linked plateau to coast and, through the coast, to an oceanic network. Third, interpretation matters. For too long, external narratives denied local authorship. and reshaped meaning for political ends. Careful archaeology, allied with oral histories and ethical practice, corrects that record and returns agency to communities who steward the place today. The kinds of knowledge we used. We move between scales and methods because each adds a kind of truth. Stone and architecture speak to organization and aesthetics. Objects, beads, birds, pots, speak to identity, craft, and exchange. Zooarchaeology and plant remains tell us what people ate and how they managed herds. Isotopes and elemental chemistry let us follow movement and provenance in ways that are invisible to the eye. Proteomics and dental calculus, when preserved, whisper of meals and microbes, and oral history stitches memory, song, and ritual into the material frame. None of these methods is magical. Each has limits. Together they triangulate toward richer, more honest accounts. What remains unsettled, and why that matters? Some questions remain intentionally open. How centralized was political authority at any one moment? Were certain enclosures exclusive, or did functions shift over centuries? How did environmental change shape politics and craft production? These are not failures, but invitations. They ask for more targeted dating, careful stratigraphic sampling, respectful molecular work, and broader regional surveys, done with local partners and minimal destructive protocols. The uncertainty is important because it reminds us to avoid tidy stories and to hold complexity as a virtue rather than an embarrassment. The ethical threads we must carry forward. Stewardship and science travel together. Archaeology is not an extraction business. It must be practice that leaves sites, stories, and communities stronger, not diminished. That means prior and ongoing consent, co-designed sampling and interpretation, capacity building for local institutions, equitable sharing of tourism and research benefits, transparent provenance work for collections abroad, and sensitivity to living ritual meaning. Where human remains are involved, the highest ethical standards apply. Where artifacts have left their home contexts, negotiation, loans, and repatriation should be earnest priorities. Scientific tools, radiocarbon, aDNA, proteomics, are powerful but should be used sparingly, ethically, and with community agreement. Why the past matters now. Great Zimbabwe is not only an archaeological case study, it is a living lesson about how societies make order, exchange, and meaning. The site shows that complexity, craft, and long-range connection arise in many places across the globe, shaped by local opportunity and global currents alike. It also shows how modern political frames can distort history, and how careful scholarship and collaborative stewardship can restore dignity and accuracy. For local communities, the stones are part of identity and continuity. For the wider world, they are a reminder to read other people's pasts with humility rather than proprietorial certainty. Practical small actions you can take if you want. If this story moved you and you'd like to act gently, learn more from community-led sources and local museums. Support their programming. When visiting heritage sites, follow local guidance, respect access rules, and support local guides. If you read about artifacts from Great Zimbabwe and foreign collections, look for institutions that practice transparent provenance and responsible loans. Support ethical archaeology by favoring research organizations that publish their community engagement policies and share data openly. A final, quiet image. Picture again that small soapstone bird, polished by many hands, placed on a ledge that catches morning light. Imagine a child centuries ago reaching for it, a potter reheating a kiln beside it, a trader bringing a string of blue beads into the courtyard, and now a modern conservator tracing its chip with careful gloves. Across time, the bird is a hinge, between hands, across trade routes, and among stories. Keep that image as a gentle talisman. The past is made of persons, not only monuments. Closing practical notes, timestamps, and an episode map are in the description, so you can return to the sections you found most calming or most useful. If you enjoyed this careful telling, consider subscribing and sharing with someone who likes slow, evidence-first storytelling. Tell me when you listen, at night, on a walk, or while making tea. Your habits shape how I write. A breathing practice to leave with one last slow breath. Inhale for 5 counts. Hold for 3. Exhale for 7. Repeat twice. Let the cadence of that breath carry the calm we cultivated here into the rest of your day or night. Thank you for walking these stones with me. For now, we close the ledger gently. Not because questions are done, but because care and curiosity continue. Stay curious, stay calm,